at our best friend, the syllabus, and where things stand. Let's see here. Okay. We are streaming. Got people here. Good. All right. Oh, go ahead and I want to start something new just for admin purposes. Just put your name in the chat for me. Just type your name in the chat just so that I have that there. Because I do keep the chat records from every class and I want to be complete. Okay. So we've made our way down through the contract last night. We got all the way through it. Paragraph 2 and 3, fixtures and personal property. As we go on down through there, get something out of my way here. There we go. We come to this part. We need to know about due diligence, the due diligence period. And if we're the buyer agent, for instance, and we're talking to that buyer client, explaining to them this contract like we did last night, except maybe faster, right? Hitting more of the highlights, not every single provision. But how do we explain this due diligence period to that buyer client? What are we gonna tell them that we do, or we suggest that we do during the due diligence period? What sorts of things are we suggesting that they check into with our help? But what are they gonna want to consider during
inspection and survey?
Yeah, survey, inspection's huge, definitely. What else? Anything else? Some other things that might come up that they might care about. Yeah, the loan. Make sure that loan, ideally, let's get a conditional loan approval if we can. Let's build enough time in that due diligence period to allow for that to happen if possible, or at least have a really strong idea that it's going to go through okay. How about anything else? There's a big important one related to the loan that we want to make sure we get done during this due diligence period. Hugely important. When that lender, we'll learn more in the next section, next chapter. There it is, the appraisal. We absolutely want that appraisal done during this due diligence period. What if it doesn't appraise? And what if the seller won't come down any and the buyer doesn't have money to add to their down payment to bridge the appraisal gap? Then they might have to choose to walk away. And so the question that is on our minds that whole time is, under contract, due diligence deadline, closing day. The big question is, do I terminate or not? And why do we want to figure that out by this date? For the buyer's best interest? Why do we want to make sure that they can decide if they need to back out, that's when they should back out?
To get the feedback.
Say that again one more time.
To get the feedback.
Yeah, which one?
The due diligence fee.
Ah, there it is. Careful. There's two fees. Yeah, the due diligence and the earnest money, and they're easy to mix up. And the buyers get that wrong all the time too, by the way. So you really have to, you get used to explaining it a lot. The due diligence fee is gone already. That went away here at the time it went under contract. That's when that due diligence fee was gone to the seller, non-refundable, pretty much no way that buyer's ever getting it back unless the seller were to breach. But in a normal transaction, if that buyer backs out during this due diligence period, they're doing so as to preserve the earnest money, so as to at least have a shot at getting that back. And I say it very carefully, and I use the words have a shot at it because, as we talked about, that seller might not sign the release. But ideally they would. And yeah, we could really more accurately call this period of time the earnest money period, because that's the money that it hinges upon. Although I know the term due diligence is what we're doing. So other things that we might want to do. Oh, that's true too, Jack. The seller disclosure, to make sure we like what that shows, if anything. Also related to the property, how about the insurance policy? Let's go ahead and shop for insurance, get an insurance agent to say, yep, here's how much it's going to be. Because we might find that the property itself has had so many claims against it for whatever reason, maybe flooding, that the insurance quotes are going to be more than average, more than what we were prepared for. So maybe that's too much for the buyer to be comfortable with. So it's all of that stuff. In other words, here's a short answer. Anything they care about that could cause them to want to back out should be checked during this due diligence process. And that's what we want to explain to our client and really impress upon them. What if it's important to them that their uncle from Arizona flies in and takes a look, and if he doesn't like it, they're not buying it? Then that needs to happen during the due diligence period, right? Whatever they care about. We saw things about the loan being reflected. We saw things about the buyer representation and what the seller is supposed to do. We saw all the different things the seller's responsible for paying, which we will get more into when we get to the closing chapter. And that brought us to the end of the actual contract to T. But let's talk about one thing, and then we'll go over and take a look at the addenda real quick. But we talked about the delay in settlement. What if we have a different date for the closing versus the settlement? Can we let the buyer move in move in early, move in before the closing day, move in before that deed gets recorded? Is that allowable? Yeah, sure. Whose permission would you need to allow that? Buyer gets to move in before closing. We had settlement. Everybody signed stuff, but we're going to let them go ahead and move in. Yeah, the seller who is not yet finished being the owner, seller. Because until closing, that's when the end date is. And maybe we've got a couple of days through the weekend, in which case there is a form for that. So let me see if I can find it. I think I brought it up among all of these other forms. There it is. So it's a very simple couple of page lease, like a baby lease. And it's just for a very short amount of time. It even says so in the red box. These red and blue boxes are great. But again, this is the buyer possession before closing. They've added this line since the last time I used this form. It's an addendum to the offer to purchase. Just as a reminder, this is not a standalone document. It is something added to the offer to purchase in the event that we're letting the buyer move in early. This is not for a year lease or any sort of long-term lease or purchase or lease option. It is for solving an immediate problem. Let's get them through a few days. Really, no more than a week or so is ideal for the maximum amount of duration for this thing. And they have another big reminder, hugely important. Talk to an insurance professional before you do anything. Let's make sure they know that what your role is. As a buyer, they've signed all the papers. They had settlement, but not closing. And so they were planning to be the new owner. And their insurance policy, their new policy was going to kick in today. But now that policy won't work for a couple more days because they're not going to be the owner yet. They're just going to be a tenant. They're still just a tenant. So in other words, they've got to talk to that insurance company and say, look, I need a tenant's policy. Please write up a quick, short tenant's policy to cover me for a few days or till I tell you otherwise, to just cover their personal property. And then for the seller who was planning to not be the owner after today, but are going to be, they need to tell their insurance company, don't stop anything. Leave me as the owner. Maybe convert it to a landlord's policy. Don't need to cover the contents because the buyer's going to go ahead and move in, but go ahead and leave that coverage alone. So that's the main advice when we allow people to move in early or the seller to stay late. Make sure the insurance is lined up properly. And it's not very many things. Again, it's about a page and a half and talks about time is of the essence. Buyer can take possession at 8 a.m. on whatever date it starts. Maybe today, like say it's Friday. We were planning to close today. Close can't happen till Monday. So 8 a.m. or today, tomorrow, whenever. And it will terminate at the earlier of closing or the termination of the contract, meaning it all falls apart. It could be that the contract falls apart, in which case they're not going to be allowed to keep renting there. We need to get them out and get that thing sold to someone else. And they have a time is of the essence here. And it also says the seller's not allowed to access the property without the buyer's consent. They can't just pop in, even though it's still their house. They've got to respect the buyer / tenant living there for that short-term rental. And then By taking possession of the property, buyer waives any more due diligence rights. Check this out. Let's think about it. The buyer's staying there for a couple of days, living there overnight. They have time to look at it really closely, even more than they have already. They've only ever just visited. And now that they're going to live there, could you imagine a world where they say, oh, wow, gosh, I didn't realize this was a problem. Oh, look at this thing over here. They have all the time in the world now to look around even closer. And if they had their way, maybe even say, now I want you to fix more stuff because I've noticed more stuff. Well, this is saying, look, you're waiving. If we let you move in early, you're waiving further due diligence rights. That part is over. We have negotiated all that. All that's left is to close. And so we are waiving those opportunities for you. And you're accepting the property in its condition at the commencement date. So all of that is a part of this little baby lease too. We're talking about the buyer possession agreement, by the way, for those who had just let in. This is what happens when we have a settlement already finished, but not yet a closing. And we just need a few days to allow the buyer to rent, basically, and live there until we get that closing done. Which, by the way, we're planning for it in this scenario to be Monday, but maybe it's not Monday. Maybe something else pops up. Maybe a lien thing pops up. Maybe they do one quick additional title search, as they do, the attorney, and find that a mechanic's lien was inserted onto the property. Therefore, we've got to wait a little longer to resolve that. So maybe a couple days turns into a week. So what else? The rent. Yeah, they're not living there for free unless the seller allows them to. Sometimes the seller says, yeah, whatever, make it zero. I don't care. I have no doubt it's going to close. But it also gives us an opportunity to put an amount in there. So a lot of times that rent, what would you guess they might negotiate for rent for those couple of days? Any idea how you might figure that out? What's the party going to do and have to pay for the rent for a few days?
Figure out the PITI and divide that, or calculate how many days,
Yeah,
that amount would equal.
That's smart. All the seller really cares about, they're not trying to make a profit here. They know, though, that they are going to have to pay their house payment, and they're not living there yet, that buyer. So the seller still has to keep making their house payment for a couple more days. They're probably going to base the rent they charge on how much that would cost, essentially. Yeah. And then additional rent, if it's delayed even further, they try to have all the possibilities in there. And then if it's terminated, the contract, the buyer immediately must vacate, return all means of access to the seller. And if they don't immediately vacate, they are bound by the terms and have to pay a holdover fee. They even have it built in here as a way to put in a dollar amount for staying past the end that they were supposed to move. The buyer's going to have utilities put in their name. Seller shouldn't have to pay them. The buyer's got to pay them. And the buyer's responsible for the upkeep, lawn maintenance, trash removal while they're staying there as well. Insurance, we talked about insurance. Make sure it's properly adjusted for the roles involved. Buyer who's living there as a tenant gets some renter's insurance. Seller is still the owner. And buyer holds seller harmless from liability and blah, blah, blah caused by anything connected with the damage or injury. Just some legal boilerplate there. Can't sublet. This is not a full-out lease with all those lease rights. We're not trying to make profits here. The buyer can't Airbnb it. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to let them hang out and live there. Go ahead and move in because their moving truck maybe was already loaded up and they didn't want to have to unload it and reload it and pay for all that. And then the seller is responsible for homeowner dues, association dues, if there are any, during this term of rental. Are pets allowed or not? What happens about eviction? If the buyer breaches, they can be evicted. And then the losing party, if this turns into a legal proceeding, the losing party has to pay the court costs. That's it. That's all this says. There's a version for the seller as well. And that's when I don't know if I've got that one or not. That's if the seller is allowed to stay past the closing date. I've negotiated those several times too, because in this market, the seller kind of has more strength, more leverage. And sometimes sellers will say, well, gosh, what do I do if this thing sells? I don't have a place to go. I'll say, well, how about we wait till offers come in, and then look around real quick. We've already been watching in the MLS things that are available. Let's see what you like in that moment. And then we can counter the offer or go ahead and put it in the MLS and tell the whole world, this seller wants to be able to rent back for a month or 2 months after closing. Whatever makes the seller comfortable, as long as maybe a buyer's okay with that. Maybe the timeline of the buyer accounts and allows for it. That's probably too long of a duration for the seller possession after closing, the seller version of this thing to be feasible. So we'd probably use more of a lease, more of a normal size lease. But if it's just a few days that the seller's spending there past closing, we would use the seller version of this. Another one, let me see. Let's take a look at the list that they have for. Here we go. They want us to talk about additional provisions, backup contracts, FHA, lead-based, short sale, buyer possession, seller possession, and vacation rental. Okay, let's look at a couple more. We've got the FHA VA financing addendum. This will make more sense after we cover the finance chapter, but long story short, if your buyer is using FHA financing or VA financing, we want to give them a few more rights than if they're using conventional. The point of an FHA loan or a VA loan is to give somebody some help who might otherwise not be able to buy a house, who might not qualify for a conventional loan. Maybe they can, but maybe they can't. Because as we'll see later, probably tonight, maybe next week, the big difference, but the big thing you need to know for this test is the difference between the FHA, VA, and conventional loan types. There's lots of other types, but those are the main top 3 that people might choose between. And when it comes to an FHA, to a conventional, let's go with that. Conventional loan means conventional, FHA, and VA loan. Well, first of all, VA loans are for who? Vets, military people. To originate a VA loan, you have to be a veteran or military veteran, right? So that also has a benefit to them that they can borrow 100% of the loan amount. 100% of the price. And another way to say that is their loan to value ratio, how much are they borrowing compared to the price, can be 100%, right? So let me do it this way. 100% LTV. They're borrowing every bit of it. They're putting 0 down payment. No down payment. And that's just a benefit we give to them. So they'd have to qualify for it, but they have a certain amount of entitlement they can borrow up to based on their service and how they were discharged. That also allows for maybe some lower credit score. So it's designed to help that veteran. An FHA loan allows for a lower down payment as well. Not quite 0 down, but more like 3.5%. 3.5% down compared to conventional, which is typically a lot of times 5% or more. Maybe 5 is a common one, 10, 15, 20% down payments. There sometimes are special loans, conventional loans that might allow for lower, but it's going to require certain credit scores and certain additional qualifying. But with FHA, it allows for that lower down payment and also a lower credit score. Again, trying to help people enjoy and benefit from home ownership. So FHA and VA loans are designed for that. A couple things about that. One, the appraisals for these two types are stricter. Stricter appraisals. Got to have a good roof. Can't have big holes in the wall. Can't have broken windows. Can't have paint peeling down to the wood, and you have to have a working range too, especially for FHA here. The point here is that we don't want to help these people get into the house only to set them up for failure because next year they have to spend $20,000 on a new roof, right? So the appraisals are more strict on the seller. And that's part of what this addendum is about. So this FHA and VA addendum, it depends on which thing you need it for. You just check the box. If it's an FHA loan that your client is getting, it's an FHA addendum. Check that box. And that says that the purchaser is not obligated to complete the purchase if the appraisal comes in low. They can choose to keep buying it and add more money to their down payment if they want to, but the property must appraise no lower than the purchase price, and they have an out. If they back out after the due diligence deadline with an FHA loan using this addendum, then they are going to get the earnest money back too. That's mainly what this says. They're not only their due diligence is gone, but their earnest money can come back to them even beyond the due diligence date, is essentially what these are saying. There's also a thing about VA loans where the seller has to, the buyer's not allowed to pay certain things. The seller has to. And that's another reason why a seller might choose not to allow offers from VA buyers. We'll get more into that later, but those issues are what are addressed here. That's why it's its own little addendum, and we'll talk more later. When we have the home inspection and we want to ask the seller to fix some things, here's the document we'll use to let them know that. Hey, seller, we had it inspected and we want 1, 2, 3, 7, 11, and 23. Those items repaired. And that's pretty much all this says. It also says the buyer allows for the inspection report to be released to the seller. We like to do this, I do, as a buyer agent, because I want to make sure they see it. I want to make sure that they see the pictures and the listing agent sees it. What do we know about material facts being disclosed? If you, the broker, for instance, as a listing agent, know that the roof leaks, are you required to tell the world? Or can you keep that a secret if the client asks you to?
You have to tell all parties involved in the transaction.
Exactly. So let's think about it. If we are the buyer agent and we have this inspection and it's a whole long list of things and the seller won't fix anything, and our buyer chooses to walk and lose their due diligence money, maybe get the earnest money back and not buy this house, what should that listing agent do if this deal dies with your buyer moves on? What should that listing agent do about that entire inspection report full of material facts they just learned? They might not have known much, claimed to know much the last time when you came along and made an offer, but now you've sent them an entire report, probably with color pictures. They know more than they did, and they should be disclosing it. So it's almost like it's sort of passive aggressive for a buyer agent saying, hey, listing agent, here's our request for repairs. I really hope your seller fixes these things, because if they don't, you're going to have to disclose all of it. You may as well just fix it for us and hold this deal together, right? Otherwise, what's going to happen? Probably harder for you to get it sold. You're going to have to tell the whole world all these things I've just disclosed to you because of the report that I sent you that you read to your client, right? So that's why I like to, as a buyer agent, suggest to my buyer to allow us to let the seller see that report. Not instead of just saying, fix these things, here's the entire report, here's all the pictures. I think it might help us maybe have a shot at them being more inclined to fix those things. They could always turn them down, but sometimes we're looking for these little strategies. We looked at the agreement to amend already. That does things like change the price and the due diligence amount and the period and the who's holding the money and the closing date. Additional provisions. Have we looked at that together? I don't think we got to this. We've talked about the mobile home thing, and that's got a provision in here. But let's look at the 6 possible items you might want to use this for. Number 1, maybe not so much in this market, but in a normal neutralized market, or certainly in a buyer's market. Buyers might say, hey, you know what? I'm going to make an offer to this seller, but I don't want that seller to be able just to sit on my offer for 2 weeks while I'm hoping and waiting for a response. Let's make them hurry up. And so we can put an expiration of the offer. If we attach this addendum, we can say this offer expires on this date at this time. And guess what? Time is of the essence. As soon as that time gets surpassed by 1 second, this offer is off the table. You can put a self-destruct mechanism on your offer with this. But keep in mind, it does indeed die at that point of the date and time you put in here. So they don't really even, they should, it would be polite to give you a response. But what if the seller doesn't like your offer and they just say its deadline is noon tomorrow, and they let noon come and go and they never called you back? There's nothing on the table anymore. There's no offer to even wait to hear back from because it died at noon. You killed it. You put that expiration date in place. That's got a thing about septic tanks. If you're buying land, for instance, it needs to perk for at least this many bedroom home, as we know septic tanks are all about. So if that's the case, use that. Here's what you'd use it for. And then if it's a rental property, we're going to want to see all the rental documents, the lease, the tenant security deposit. What's going to happen to that? Will the seller transfer any pet fees over to the buyer when they're buying that property? So good idea to build this into your offer if it's a rental or income property. This part over here. Yeah. Okay. Top of the next page. This one looks suspicious, maybe, because I've told you, I've just preached to you, don't write legal language, but then they have this entire 12 line paragraph of just saying, fill in this blank. That's sort of like writing language. That's a big blank. And so what it says is the seller agrees to do the following at their own expense. The reason we would use this is for things maybe like carpet allowances or replacing the carpet, actually replacing, not just giving money for, or anything that your buyer is worried about that we want to make sure is built into the contract. And we expect for this price that the buyer's offering, they expect this to be done. Maybe repaint the living room. Maybe replace the shag carpet with something modern. Maybe anything, could be anything. And that's allowable to use this for. So it's largely cosmetic things. If they're worried about something showing up on the inspection report, one take could be, well, the inspector's probably going to find it. But if they're really worried, I don't want to just sit back and wait and hope they find it. I want to make sure that they do and we address it. So yeah, I'm going to mention it to the inspector. Hey, go look in that crawl space. We saw something weird. Or in addition to that, I might say, let's go ahead and build it in so that seller knows, look, at this price we're offering you, this ridiculous over asking price offer, we expect that weird thing in the crawl space to be dealt with, or whatever it is, or the carpet allowance or the paint or whatever the issue might be. If there's a mobile home, if it is a mobile home, or if there's one on the property in addition to the house, this is a convenient place to put the VIN number, the vehicle identification number for that mobile. If it's a double wide or a triple wide, that's a place for you to do it. And then if there's a pool or a hot tub or a spa, the inspector needs to see it functioning to ascertain if it works right. And so if it's wintertime, maybe they've shut it all down, and we need to identify who's responsible for getting it back up and running for the inspection. Seller or buyer, check the box. And then they mentioned here an extra item from last year. Actually, this is a new one. Off-site or separate lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, storage unit. We saw that in the contract last night. And so it just gives you a way to identify that there's another thing, another improvement that comes along with this property. The reason they've got boat slip, garage, parking space, storage unit, these are typical extra things that aren't attached to the property itself when it's a condo or maybe a townhouse. You've been through those neighborhoods and you see that there's like a little bank of 5 garages. And so not everybody in the whole complex can get a garage, but those who paid extra might get one. And if that's included in this sale, here's where we would identify it and attach it. Make sure we don't overlook it. Make sure everybody knows this is part of this sale. So that's the additional provisions addendum. Hits 7. It used to be 4, and then it grew. Now we're up to 7 of some things you might use. Out of all of these, obviously case specific, but there was a time that I used the expiration on every offer. But in this market, we're just thankful the seller gives us the time to think about it. So I kind of don't want to push them on that expiration. We can always back out, by the way. Anytime we're tired of waiting for the seller to respond, maybe the buyer sees another house pop up on the search that I've set up automatically. And they're like, oh, we like that way better. Let's just don't even buy that first one. And I could immediately tell the listing agent, look, I know your people are thinking about it, but we're out. We are hereby withdrawing. And so don't even worry about it anymore. Or you could put the deadline. Let's talk about lead-based paint. We did that in the environmental, but a closer look, I think we did look at it before. It's just this box that explains to the consumer what it's all about. Houses built before 78 might have some in there, and the seller has some options. If they know for sure there is lead-based paint because they had it tested for some reason, they have to disclose that. If they don't know, that's okay too, but just disclose what you know. The seller could say, I don't know, I never had it tested. They could also, it also shows that they're, if they have the records, that they're acknowledging that, records proving the lead-based paint exists, or if they don't have any. And then the part where the buyer acknowledges once they're making an offer, they call or they look on the MLS and they say, we want to make an offer. Do you have the lead-based paint disclosure for this property? And I, as the listing agent, would need to make sure they get it or have access to it because they can download it from the MLS. And so we're just saying that the buyer acknowledges whatever the seller has just told them up here. The buyer also has received that pamphlet that we're responsible for giving them, the PDF free from the EPA about lead-based paint. And what are they planning to do about all this? The buyer checks, am I going to investigate further, do a risk assessment? Or, in my experience, more frequently they say, you know what, forget about it. I'm not worried about knowing because I'm going to paint over it anyway. And since 1978, there were probably 48 coats of paint and encapsulating it just fine. So those are all the options. And then the agent for the seller would initial here, basically saying, I've told him everything I'm supposed to tell him. By the way, we're not going to go over this whole thing. It's 16 pages, but this is an offer to purchase if it's new construction specific, because that's a whole different animal, right? There's other things involved in buying brand new. There's maybe a pre-construction evaluation period. There's site plans and specification sheets. What are you planning to put in this house? What bare minimum upgrades and features? And they might talk about the different installments that will be due, additional amounts of money over the time duration of the building. And what else? Talks about the buyer's loan, soil suitability and environmental things and flood hazard and septic system, perking. So all those things that new construction would need to also cover are dealt with in this very specific kind of contract. Part about R value requirements for the insulation, the how thermal, what kind of thermal barrier minimums according to building code are required, because that building code, there's a state one, but there's also a local one. The local one might be more strict, so they don't have a built-in state only R value. It's going to depend on your area. And then the backup contract addendum. If our buyer sees this perfect house online and wants us to go show it to them, and we take them out there, by the time we have had a chance to make the appointment and go look at it, I've had this happen. We're walking through the house and I get a notification that it has already gone under contract 2 minutes earlier. As I was opening the door, the seller accepted an offer on this house. My buyer's usually disappointed, of course. They usually say things like, well, why didn't they tell us that they were thinking about it? They don't have to. They were negotiating with someone else. That is not a requirement. And so if they really still like the house, they're disappointed, but they could use this. First thing would be, hey, let's find out from the seller, will they let us be in a backup position? By using this addendum, this buyer, our buyer, can say, well, since I'm not the primary buyer, at least maybe I can be the secondary backup buyer. If that primary buyer for any reason backs out, this lets them be perfectly situated and positioned to be in that primary position. If the original current buyer goes away, we have the second spot reserved, in other words. So that's what this is about. This is not about a short sale. They specifically say this. This is about being that backup buyer. And it says, that. They don't need to provide due diligence money yet because that's non-refundable, and it's not fair for them to put non-refundable money up until they know they're the buyer. But they would be required to do earnest money most likely. But again, all that's negotiable anyway. Here's the part about it. Earnest money, additional earnest money, due diligence money would be due and payable upon delivery of notice that they are now the primary buyer. So again, due diligence is not expected until you become, and unless you become the primary buyer. And they talk about the dates of settlement and due diligence period, and that's about it. That's it. If they even have a place. This is a new one too this year. If the buyer must receive notice of moving to that primary status because the current buyer who is in that position has backed out, no later than 5 p.m. on a certain date. Time is of the essence. They can put a kill date in here. So look, they might say, look, I'm not waiting as a backup any longer than this amount of time. I'll give it a week or a couple of weeks. And then, of course, they can always back out at any time and make this go away if they want to give up on it. Useful, pretty useful contract or addendum. I like this one a lot. This one is called the response to buyer's offer. It gives 3 possible options. You only use one of the 3 depending on what your strategy is. One of them, this is for when we have, usually for multiple offers, but it doesn't have to be. This first option says this, thank you for your offer. I cannot accept it as written, and so this is officially a rejection. This is not a counteroffer, but I would favorably consider if you do the following. And now you and your seller client can put in whatever would make this a dream offer for your seller. Seller could say, I don't like your price, but if you'll go up another $50,000 to $700,000, yes, I'll think about it. This is not an automatic do this and I definitely will accept it. Look down here. It says, we are free to consider and may at any time accept other offers. If the above changes are acceptable to you, submit another offer and try again with the noted changes. I'm not committing myself to saying you're definitely going to get it if you make these suggestions or fulfill these suggestions. It could be the dates, the closing date, due diligence, the deposit amounts, the price, anything your client as a seller client wants to see to make this a wonderful offer for them would be what you would counsel them and work through filling in these blanks for. So we could use this with just one offer on the table. We don't want to, your client doesn't want to counter because they won't want to, who knows, maybe they want to be free to open it up to all those showings that are still going on. So this would be a way to sort of counter without countering. It's not a counter, but that way we don't have to worry that if we do tell them what would be a perfect world for us, that other showing that's happening today, those other 20 showings that today are who could bring us an offer would be something you wouldn't have access to. So nice and flexible, super pro seller, really helps the seller side. And this could also be used in a multiple offer situation. You could give one of these to each of the offerors, and it could be different for every one of them because they've all made different offers. And you could say, hey, to make yours better, I would suggest this price, these terms. And you could do a different one for the other person and the other person for all 5 or 10 or 20. In all the update classes, I'm still asking how many multiple offers they've experienced, and I'm seeing 20s and 30s from the last several years. So you could do that. Another use of this form instead of that option is a place to get it in writing that the seller wants a response by a certain date and time. You might have seen that show up on Zillow or somewhere. It says seller will accept all offers. Well, no, it'll probably say seller wants to receive any offers by tomorrow at noon. And this is just an official way to have that in writing. It's not a requirement. If the seller wants to set a deadline, we don't have to do it this way. We could just write it in the MLS and tell the world that way. But this just gives you, as the listing agent, a way to have the seller's signature so they could never come back and say, I never told you to put that deadline. Well, by having this signed, you've got that safety net, right? And here, what does it say? It says, should you choose to submit another offer, I would encourage you to submit your best offer ASAP and no later than the date I've put in this blank. Understand that we may, at our discretion, choose anything else. You can try, but we're not obligating ourselves to you. Sort of like what we saw up here, that other option. And then the third thing you can do with this form is just simply use it as an official written rejection. Check this box and it says, I'm rejecting this one. Just to have something, maybe the buyer agent says, I know they don't like my offer. They're rejecting it, but could you maybe get something in writing from the seller so I'd have that for my files? That's not something we see all the time, but maybe for some reason they ask for this to happen, and this will be an easy way for this to take place and to give them that written version of the rejection. Okay. Let's take a look at that syllabus again. See where we stand. Okay. We did these, lead base, short sale. We need to look at that one, and vacation rental. We'll look at those in a little bit. See if I've got it. Here we go. So we'll learn more about a short sale in the finance chapter as well, but the short version of what a short sale is, first of all, it has nothing to do with speed. We're not closing them faster. Short means short of the full amount the seller owes the lender. So what happens when a seller gets in trouble financially, can't keep making their payment, and maybe the market is not like what we have now? The real estate market is more of a buyer's market, and the values have gone down too. And so the loan amount that is owed to the lender, let's say, is $300,000, but the market value of the house is only $260,000. You still owe your lender as the seller. This is from the seller's perspective. Seller's lender is owed $300,000 still on the loan, but if we were to sell this property for the very most we could, there's not enough proceeds to pay off that loan. And so this happened a lot in 2008, 9, 10. And so we had to learn what short sales were, because what could happen, option one, we could have a foreclosure. The seller just can't hang in there, can't make their payment, and the foreclosure notice comes out because they're several months behind, and sorry, gets foreclosed. How can they avoid foreclosure? Another choice is to maybe have a loan modification. Maybe beg the lender to please let me do something different. Can we roll the amount I owe you back onto the end of the loan? Can we work out a payment plan where I pay the mortgage every month and also a couple $100 on top to go toward the part I've missed? That might be impossible because the whole point is you don't have money, right? Something has happened. So unless you get a lottery winner or have help from grandma, that might not work either. So frequently what the options for avoiding foreclosure were left with included this, a short sale. In this case, what are we doing? We're asking the seller's lender for approval to pay them less than what we owe them, we being the seller. Please, lender, let me give you less than I owe you. Let me sell it for a price that I can get for it, but by doing that, I'm not going to be able to pay you all that full amount. And so you need that lender's permission to go along with this deal. And as such, first of all, it takes a long time. It takes a long time to go through that lender process of approval. your seller, if it's your client and you're the listing agent and your seller's in trouble and they want to pursue this short sale possibility, you're gonna need to give them some counsel. You're gonna use this short sale addendum to help them understand. Well, first of all, we're gonna need to get the short sale packet from the lender. Call the lender, say, I want to do a short sale. Send me your packet, which means a checklist of all the documents they want the seller to see, to show. The seller has to prove the hardship. That's step one. Pull all the documentation. It could be tax returns. It will be bank statements. It'll be a hardship letter, basically a sad letter that says, yeah, here's what happened. I lost my job. I have medical bills. I've got all these issues. So proving the hardship is step one. In the meantime, we put it on the market, but we have to tell the whole world this is a short sale. Fair warning to your buyer, this may not go quickly. Normal contract, normal duration of days on the market in a typical sale, which is not a desperate one or a short sale situation, we might put it on the market today and expect to close by the end of End of June. Maybe anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe faster if it's a cash sale. We don't have to get loan approval and worry about that. With a short sale, I've waited 6 months. I've even waited a year to get approval from that seller's lender. That's a buyer that has to be patient. And so we need to warn that buyer, here's what can happen. Put your patience hat on, because this is a short sale and it's not going to be quick. And so this addendum spells out all of those things so everybody's on the same page and they understand, yeah, this is what we're in for. If the price is not sufficient to let the seller pay off the cost of the sale, then we would have to do the short sale, and it's based on that lender's permission. Talks about that the buyer, by the way, can get tired of waiting, and they have the right to walk away from this and walk away from this contract. It's not considered breach. They don't have to give any money. The due diligence period extends through the 15th day following the notice of approval from the short sale. When we finally get approval that the lender's going to go along with the short sale, then there are 15 days of due diligence period built in here. And probably pretty smart to go ahead and do the due diligence research. The buyer that's trying to buy this should maybe go ahead and start doing inspections so that they can go ahead and tell the seller what the issues are. But if the seller has money trouble, do you think the seller might typically be able to afford to pay for repairs? Probably not. But the buyer still has the right to do the inspections and at least know what they're getting into. And then the settlement date will be the 30th day after the delivery of notice of approval. So it's sort of like a hurry up and wait, or a wait then hurry up situation. We're waiting and waiting and waiting for the seller's lender approval, but then we've got to jump on it all really fast. And it really is sort of, they're the boss. They're running this show, and whatever they need is what we have to deliver, because it's their permission that all of this hinges on. So this also talks about that the buyer has the right to walk away. The property, whether or not the property has gone into foreclosure, that could be a thing. Has it been filed yet? And is the seller considering bankruptcy protection? So it just spells out all those possibilities so that everybody knows what to expect. This might be a long, drawn-out process. Let's go ahead and take our break. I'll see you back here in 10 minutes.
Somebody's radar, son.
Cover for me. It's getting old.
Tell your brother I said hey.
Thank you, Pastor. Cover for me. It's getting old. Thank you, man. Love ya.
You're somebody's radar, son.
It's not a big deal. It's just a letter saying that there's interest.
Shut up.
Yeah, it's a big deal, dude. I'm gonna get that scholarship. I'm gonna get us out of here. I don't want to end up like Dad.
Hey, you guys mind if I join you?
Yeah, that's my appetite.
We're family.
We're family. You're a drunk who left us after our mom died. Oh, you were as good at football. What'd you say?
I was in the family, right? Understand about football season?
James, a scholarship for this boy.
Track season's around the corner. They give scholarships for track.
I can do this. I've got nothing to lose and a scholarship to gain. And you're gonna come with me wherever I go.
I don't need your help with my kids.
Your boys don't need a coach. They need a dad. You're gonna look up one day and they will have moved on.
Dave, you're good, bud. It's all part of his plan, right?
You're not the first person to wrestle with his faith.
Trust him. He's gonna meet you wherever you're at.
Really? It's that simple?
I know life can be confusing. It's full of ups and downs.
Why is this so hard? I believe in the plan, and I believe in you.
God does love you. He loves you like crazy.
I'm Zach. I'm the running back at Bessemer.
I don't date football players.
I'm gonna convert you.
I heard he scored 5 times.
Yeah, it's almost 6.
Tell your brother I said hey.
I'm Zach. I'm the running back at Bessemer.
I don't.
All right, welcome back. Let's come on back together. Let me finish up that short sale addendum. I think I glossed over a part of it that I want you to notice here. The part of the provisions of this short sale scenario are these. The Real Estate Commission requires offers from other buyers to be presented all the time. How many offers do we as brokers have to present to our client? When we have a real estate license, we must present all offers, all of them. So this is a reminder that even though we're under contract or we're waiting for this short sale to be approved, any more additional offers that come in have to be presented to the seller. And also, the Real Estate Commission requires that listing agent, seller's agent, to inform lien holders of all offers received after a request for short sale. In other words, we got to tell the short sale lender that we're asking for this favor from that another offer came in, and they're going to want to look at it, and they might want to swap it and like that one better than this one. And it's right here. Is there an offer currently? with this particular buyer proposing a short sale for purchase for this particular listing? Is there an existing offer in this moment? Yes or no? Check the box. Offers from other buyers may be accepted by the seller and become contracts prior to that notice of approval of this short sale. So you could be beaten by other offers coming in. Unless this contract has been terminated, seller will promptly notify buyer of any additional offers, seller's acceptance of an additional contract, the lien holder substituting a contract for another one, and approval of anything else too, and closing of any contract as well. So it's pretty discouraging for, I guess, a buyer if they're going to have to really like the property to go through all of these restrictions and limitations and possibilities. They're going to have to, they can't be in a hurry because they could be beaten at any time as well by another better offer. Let's look at the last one that they mentioned in the syllabus, the vacation rental addendum. What's happening here? It's shorter than your typical lease, right? It's a vacation rental, meaning it's a few days, a few weeks, maybe at the most. And so important things need to be addressed here, like the eviction process goes faster for these. Could you evict somebody in a 3-day lease or a 1-week lease for vacation rental? Sure, you might have to. Maybe they got drunk the first night and trashed the place. You going to leave them there? No, you're going to want to evict them. So all the same eviction rules for a normal duration lease apply in a vacation rental, but faster. Other things here, the big one is the 180 days there it is. Sellers may enter into the rental agreement provided such agreement acknowledges authorization shall not constitute buyer's agreement to honor any such agreements. In other words, the buyer has to honor leases that are in place for 180 days after the closing date. You can't not honor those vacation rental leases as the new owner. You've got to honor anything within 180 days after. And then it talks about maybe there's a rental manager involved. And here's the contact information, and the buyer has the option of retaining a different management firm than this one. And what else? Sellers required to disclose to the buyer the time periods the property is subject to the rental, the 180 days provision. Tenants can get a refund of any payments for rental agreements not honored by the buyer that are outside that 180 days. And no later than 20 days after closing, the buyer or agent tells all the tenants that basically what their rights are. And that's about it. Pretty short, but just acknowledging some important points as to a shorter term. So those are the addenda. And we talked about the offer and contract already. Let's go through the actual slides because we're probably going to be, a lot of this stuff is already going to be addressed. So let's head over there. Take a look at this. Here we go. This is from chapter 10. We had made our way through it, but then we got away from it to talk about and show you all those forms. And so I think we left off somewhere around here. We get all of our forms through NCAR, North Carolina Association of Realtors, combined with the NC Bar. And we already know this part. This is what we went through at great detail. Be legible, fill in all the blanks. Don't forget that things must be in writing to be enforceable. Don't forget the statute of frauds applies to contracts. And it's because of this, it's so the judge can enforce things. They can't enforce something that's not in writing. The provision called UETA, Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, says that signing all this stuff without printing it out and using a pen is okay. Electronic signing is legal. You could be beholden to a purchase completely from a phone. I've sat at lunch on Sunday and put an offer together with my phone, sent it out to everybody for electronic signing. It's not fun. It's a little bit agonizing having to place things in the right field and get signatures and things, but it's doable, and certainly with the laptop. So that's legal also. Most important document in a transaction, I've asked you that several times. The contract informs the deed, right? Therefore, it's more important than the deed. If a term needs to be added to an offer to purchase and contract, the broker should just write it in, true or false. Just start writing and thinking up all your creative writing courses you've ever taken and go to town. True or false? Yeah, no. We can't write language. Exactly right. If a term needs to be added, what sort of form would we use?
Addendum.
Yes, an addendum, right? Addenda for adding it to an offer, amendments for adding things and changing the contract. Exactly right. Starts with that offer to purchase. We know about the 19 provisions, not necessarily 19 blanks to fill in, but the provisions that we went through and realized, okay, got to have the names, got to have the legal description, and the other things that we saw too. You don't need to know them. You just need to know that they exist. Also, your clients, the buyer and the seller, could draft their own contracts. They could say, I don't like this one. Here's the North Carolina form, buyer. I don't want to use it. I'm going to have my attorney send you over the one I want to use. And then for you to be able to use it and fill in those blanks, you would have to make sure it had these things in it. Or the attorney could just do the whole thing. And you're a part of it, but the attorney is drafting a custom contract that you didn't have to facilitate them signing. Since you're not having to fill in the blanks. But if you are having to have a pre-printed contract to fill in the blanks, it's got to have those 19 things. 2 things that cannot be in a contract are what? What can you not address in an offer to purchase and contract?
Brokerage compensation.
Exactly. And a limit of liability. Let's look at the contract itself again. If we were to want to put that in here, how could a broker do so? I received an offer last year from somebody, and it was a multiple offer situation too. And that agent had come over here to the addenda section, and she didn't check any of these boxes. She added one. She checked this box, identify additional any other addenda. And she put something like C addendum B or A. And it was a created custom addendum that said, oh, by the way, I should tell you this. My seller on this transaction wanted to pay the buyer agent 2.5% commission. That was the commission being offered to the buyer agent for this one, 2.5%. Her addendum said this offer contingent upon seller paying a 3% buyer agency commission. Is that going to work based on what we just learned? That is exactly what you're not allowed to do. So I had to call her and say, what am I supposed to, I was nicer than this, but what am I supposed to do with this? This is not allowed. You can't change the commission in the contract. What could she have done if she didn't like the 2.5% that we were offering? She would have needed to call ahead and say, before we bring our offer, I'm just curious, is that 2.5 firm? Would they pay 3? Another choice she could have made is to let her buyer, which she should have done no matter what, is to say, hey, buyer client, on this transaction, if you buy this listing, they're only paying me 2.5, but I charge 3. And so I'm going to need 0.5% from you. That should have been a discussion no matter what. Most agents, I would dare say a lot of agents are scared of that discussion. They don't want to scare the buyer away because a lot of other agents have improperly been explaining it a different way and saying, you'll never have to pay me my fee. The seller always pays my fee. Don't need anything from you. I work for you for free because the other side will pay me, which is the wrong way to explain it. So she did it the absolutely worst possible way. She tried to build it into the contract. It can't touch the contract. It would need to be addressed separately. Another place we see the commission discussion when it comes to offers is, remember that scenario where we are helping our buyer purchase in an area that is not an MLS that we subscribe to? We don't subscribe. We're not members of that MLS, but our buyer wants to buy a house listed there. Well, all of those cooperation commission amounts listed in that MLS are not for us. None of them are for us because we aren't fellow subscribers to that MLS. We have to call that listing agent and say, hey, please, would you please pay me? You don't have to pay me anything because I'm outside your MLS, but I notice you're paying 3%. That'd be fine with me. Would you pay me that? So basically you would use a form separate from the offer that says this listing agent, this seller is going to pay this commission to this buyer agent if we can work out the transaction. So all of that would have to be its own separate standalone, not involved, not a part of, not a condition to the contract itself. And then no disclaimer of your responsibilities. You can't say in that contract, I might be terrible at this, don't sue me, bro. Or the square footage might not be correct. It's subject to the approval or confirmation by the buyer's agent. That's not going to work. You're still responsible for it as the listing agent or as the buyer agent. Neither one can have any sort of brokerage limited liability mentioned in the contract. It's not the place for that. We can't practice law without a license. I've beat you over the head with that enough. And if the buyer backs out of the contract after the due diligence deadline date, what happens to the due diligence money? The deadline date has come and gone. 5 p.m. on that date, we're past it. What happens to the due diligence money and the earnest money in the event of backing out outside of the due diligence period?
Getting nothing back.
Exactly.
Due diligence goes to the seller.
Exactly.
There's a chance that they can get the earnest money back. Depends on whether they breached or not.
Was that William that said it something first? I think that was you, right, William?
Yeah, I said they get nothing.
So we have two possible answers. One person said get nothing back if we back out outside of the due diligence period. And then Alfred said you might get something back. Let's take a look at the timeline just so it solidifies in our heads. So we've got this under contract period. We've got the closing date. We've got the due diligence deadline. We've been talking about backing out here this whole time, in which case they're definitely not getting the due diligence back. That went away on the first day. But this is a time when they might get the earnest money back within this period. But once we get to this part, then the earnest money is no longer on the table for the buyer. The seller gets to keep it. That's why we put so much pressure in the buyer, making sure to know by this date, time is of the essence, literally, because it's in there. Let's make sure that we're confident in moving forward or not. So they're not getting anything back. If it's outside of that due diligence period, that earnest money is now just as gone as the due diligence money. So good pointing out of that. I could see that being a test question. Really have to have a good grasp of that. So in this case, buyer gets nothing back. We know this already. No ambiguity allowed. Property description needs to be clear and specific. Use the legal description, but also the address too. Put anything you can to identify the property, both formal and informal descriptions. The contract has price and terms and financing and any sort of seller concessions. We saw the part where if the seller's going to pay closing costs for the buyer, we saw the blank where we would put that in there. We know that good faith, the earnest money is also known as good faith money. I explain it this way to a buyer. I say, look, buyer, you got to write 2 checks probably. They are negotiable. They could be 0, but I doubt we'll have success getting approved and accepted if you don't. One of them is for due diligence money. It is non-refundable. It goes straight to the seller as soon as the offer becomes a contract, and you're never getting that back, and except for as a credit at closing. If this were to fall apart and you chose not to buy it, you're not getting it back. The other check is for earnest money like this, called good faith money, and I like to explain it as a promise or sort of as a sign of your good faith. You're saying, yep, I like this house and I'm going to make a significant effort to buy it, or at least think about it and maybe back out during the due diligence period. But I'm so serious about this that I will set aside some of my own money into a trust account out of my control or access for the time that I'm going to be trying to accomplish this goal. If we go through with it and close, this money as well as the due diligence money counts as a credit to the buyer's side. It's going to be that much less the buyer needs to bring to closing. If this thing falls apart and the buyer chooses to walk away and not pursue and terminate this contract, then it depends on when they terminate as to whether they'll get this money back. Terminate before the deadline? Yes. Terminate afterward? No. Oh, here's a nice testable question they like to hit you with. It's not required. It's not an essential element that makes the contract valid or not, and it's not considered consideration. That could be an easy miss. I could see a lot of people being confused about the words here. Earnest money and due diligence money is not the consideration. When they reference that a contract has to have consideration, they're talking about the price paid at the end on closing day. That's the consideration. What earnest money and due diligence money would be better described as is liquidated damages. That's what we would call them. Don't call them consideration. Even though they're going to be credited to the buyer at the end, it's just one of those silly test-taking things you just have to know. That earnest money, when we do collect it as a part of an offer, it's got to be kept in a trust account once we go under contract. And it's got to be put in that trust account within 3 days of receipt. If our firm is going to hold the money in our trust account, because we have one, we may not, by the way, but if we do, and it's going to be held by us, then we have to put it in that trust account within 3 days of receiving it. And then if there's a dispute about that earnest money, as we learned yesterday, the parties would have to give us clearance and permission as to who's going to get it. Is the buyer getting it back? Is the seller getting any of it? Are they going to mix it, split it? We have to have it in writing before we, the custodian of the trust account, would be allowed to give it out in the way they want us to. They may never come to that agreement. The parties might be so mad at each other that they say, I'm not giving it up. I'm not authorizing the buyer gets anything back. They shouldn't have backed out. Or the buyer says, I'm not letting the seller keep my money. I got to go buy a house. They screwed this whole thing up and I need that back. If they just can't agree, then we give them 90 days to try. And if they fail to still agree, as the custodian of the trust account where this money is parked, I have to tell them both, look, in 90 days, I'm turning it over to the clerk of court. It's no longer my problem. It's your problem. And the court will decide how to disperse it. We know about effective date. It's when what? The last party has signed and initialed, and the communication of that initial and signature has gone across the fence. Now we have an executory contract. So it's hugely important. Effective date is when it became a contract. It's the birth date, so to speak. That due diligence fee and the due diligence period are negotiable. They could be zero. It's sort of like paying money to investigate the property, but not really, because it could be zero. So you could be paying nothing for the privilege and still have the period of time to investigate. But it's not required. Expires. The due diligence period expires at 5 p.m. on the date you put in the blank. And the fee is deposited, and hopefully cash to deposited immediately, non-refundable. Seller can go to Disney, buy a car, whatever they want to, pay off their loan. By the way, they got so big in these last several years that some people had a transaction where it went under contract, but then the buyer backed out, maybe because it didn't appraise or the repairs that were requested, or the inspector found too much wrong with it, but the seller still got to keep the due diligence money. And they had so much of it that they could pay off their mortgage with the due diligence money. So they came out probably further ahead, failing to sell their house than they did actually succeeding in selling. You can back out for any or no reason during that period and still get the earnest money back as long as seller signs the release. But according to the contract, they should. And we've belabored this point enough. So the absolute minimum amount that can be written up as due diligence or earnest money is what? The rock bottom lowest.
0.
Negotiable all the way down to 0. You got it. Settlement is signatures of all the paperwork, not transfer of ownership yet. That's not going to happen till closing. Settlement, if we go past the date, as we saw in the contract, an automatic 7-day extension built in. You can't, as the seller, be mad at the buyer. You can be mad at them, but you can't hold them accountable and say, hey, buyer, you're 3 days past the date. I want money. I want to charge you a penalty. Not allowed. You have this built-in 7-day automatic extension. And as the broker, we want to make sure they understand this before it ever becomes actual reality. Doesn't always happen, by the way. There's the delay of closing isn't unusual, but it's not the norm either. But we just need to always prepare our client that this could happen. Closing occurs when that deed is recorded, right? That's in North Carolina, the point at which the keys can be given to buyer and the money can be given to everybody who gets money, including us. We don't get our money till it closes, till the deed is recorded, and until the seller gets their proceeds. We know what they should investigate. We just talked about it. Everything they want to, anything and everything. There's no automatic financing contingency. This is something they like to test you on too. Does the standard offer to purchase form 2T have a provision in it that says if the buyer does not get approved for their loan, they don't have to buy the house? Obviously they couldn't buy the house, but they're going to get all their money back. They're going to get their earnest money and or due diligence money back. No, there is none of that. That would be a loan contingency. So it's not built into the contract. It's not an automatic thing at all. What if your buyer wants it to be in there? Then we would need to get an attorney to draft one, custom. In a market like this, probably a terrible idea. Good luck finding a seller willing to let your buyer get all their earnest money and due diligence back if the loan doesn't go through. You'd be lucky if the seller spends enough time once they've realized this is part of your offer to finish reading the rest of the offer. They're not doing it. But probably a buyer's market where the sellers are desperate and the buyers are in the power position, I could see it happening then. But there's not an automatic contingency that protects those deposits and gives them back to the buyer if the loan doesn't get approved. They could add one, but it's not an automatic. Who's going to have a concern about keys and possession being transferred prior to actually closing? What professional, what entity or professional is going to need to be consulted if we have to have a buyer possessing before closing or a seller staying and staying there after closing? What do we need to look into and advise the client to talk to? That's a great guess. A little more nuanced than the attorney. The buyers live in there before they become the owner, or the sellers live in there after they're no longer the owner. We want to make sure that coverage is in place. What kind of coverage? The right kind of insurance coverage. You got it. Exactly right. Offer and acceptance. We have that back and forth process. We talked about it in chapter 9. So the offeree could accept the offer, in which case now we're under contract once they've communicated their acceptance. And in the acceptable manner specified in the contract, we saw the page where we can specify that. It could be your email as the agent, email, phone number, fax number, whatever that is. So that's where we identify. I think it's like the second to last page. And so it could look like this. The offer is made and then it's accepted. You could also have an offer and then it's countered by the seller and then countered again by the buyer, back and forth. And then finally the seller says, no, this just isn't going to work. We're still too far apart. And ultimately rejection, therefore never became a contract. You could have this where it ultimately becomes an acceptance, right? And the seller says, oh, okay. Or the buyer for that matter. Either side could be the final one that says yes or no. If an offeree wants to change the terms of an offer before acceptance, doing this would create what? Making a change to that offer is what?
Counteroffer.
Counteroffer. And also, what is it also considered? Even before it's considered a counteroffer, it is first and foremost a rejection and then a counter proposal. Thank you, Jack. Exactly. Communicating to the agent is considered the same as communicating to the client. That means if we tell the listing agent that the offer was accepted, it's the same as telling the client. Yes, they need to go ahead and do that, but it's good enough. And now we can consider this thing to be under contract. It also means if we are the listing agent and we tell the buyer agent that their offer was accepted, it's the same thing as letting the buyer know. And that's the point at which this has become a contract, when we told the buyer agent. It also means that If that is not a buyer agent that's helping that buyer, but instead a sub-agent to seller, because they're too weak to successfully explain how agency works. How do you not understand this is the person that's taking good care of you, and why would you turn them down? Maybe that's a little extreme, but for whatever reason, they won't let them be the buyer agent. Then by default, they're the sub-agent. Now, if the listing agent tells that person this was accepted, it's not yet under contract until they go ahead and tell the buyer. When the buyer's going to need to know if that's the relationship they have with their selling agent. So it looks like this, and you might see a non-graphical or more of a paragraph version of this type of question on the test. We've got ABC Realty helping the buyer and XYZ Realty, helping the seller. And the buyer is the client of this person, John. John is the agent. When we see that the buyer is John's client, we can immediately say, oh, their relationship is that John is the buyer agent to this person because of the word client. If we saw the word customer instead of client, then we would know that John is not a buyer agent, but instead he is a sub-agent to seller. So in this case, he is a buyer agent. Telling John is the same as telling his buyer. And then we've got Mary, the agent, the listing agent for the seller. That's her client. So John delivers the offer on Monday at 6 p.m. The seller signs the offer in front of their agent, Mary, at 8 p.m. That's basically taking communication out of the mix. They have communicated by signing it in front of her, right? So we don't have to worry about did they call her and tell her. She knows. It was communicated from the seller to their agent, Mary, because Mary watched them sign it. And then Mary calls John at 9 p.m. and says, we have a deal. And then John calls the buyer an hour later at 10 p.m. and says, we have a deal. And then the following morning, John physically takes the contract over to his buyer client Tuesday morning. At what point in this process did this thing go under contract? Which bullet point became under contract?
Fourth.
Third one.
Anybody else? A different idea, different opinion? Got somebody says the second one, somebody says the third one. What else? So it comes down to communication. Signing is not enough. And so when the seller signed in front of Mary, that was essentially like communicating to Mary that it had been accepted. But the problem is it's about that volleyball net in the middle. Now, Agent Mary communicating over to John is what counts. So the third one is the right one. That third point, 9 p.m., when Mary told John, communicated to the buyer agent that it was signed and accepted, now we're under contract. Has this paperwork gotten over there yet? No, but the communication did, and so now we are under contract. Does that make sense? We had 3 different possible guesses there, but I totally get it. It could have been the 10 o'clock, but only if John were a sub-agent instead of a buyer's agent, where the buyer is the customer instead of the client to him. So, yeah, here's another one, a little more graphic one. John delivers the offer. This time, John is not a buyer agent. He's a sub-agent to his buyer. His buyer is a customer to him. And delivers the offer at 6. Seller signs in front of Mary at 8. Same thing. Mary calls John at 9. We have a deal. John calls the buyer at 10. We have a deal. John delivers the contract the next morning. It's the point at 10 p.m. when the buyer was told. The buyer customer was told by their sub-agent. Because John is not a buyer agent, he's only a sub-agent. There's this thing called a mailbox rule you might have run across in your material. And the mailbox rule is about the acceptance being delivered. So it could be that the client signed off on that offer, put it in an envelope, licked a stamp, and put it in the mailbox. The date it's in the mailbox, probably the postmark date, right? But technically it could be the date you put it in the box at your street. It's just that you can't prove you did it. The postmark is probably going to be what comes up in a court case if it were ever got to court. The mailbox rule says today is when it got into the possession of the U.S. Postal Service. So today it is essentially the delivery date. It says pretty much today's date is when we consider it having been delivered. Not when they actually received it, because it's now out of my hands. I put it in the mail, and so they're going to get it in 3 days, but I can consider today the delivery date. But be careful. I heard it wrong from an update student just the other day. This is not about the money. You can't say the due diligence was received by the date you stuck it in the mail. You can't say the checks were received, earnest money, due diligence. In fact, I'd rather those be hand delivered or wired, electronically delivered, but probably not mailed. But they could be. But the mailbox rule does not apply to the money, only to acceptance of offers. By the way, we never do this. People aren't mailing offer acceptance today. They are emailing, they're docu-signing. All of that is instant. We don't need 3 days anymore. It's just antiquated old rules that used to be a thing and no longer really are, but they still exist. So we've got to teach it, but we're probably not doing that in real life. How can an offer be terminated? We learned all this already. The offer could be rejected or countered, either or, right? They could just flat out say, this is too low for me to even dignify with a response. Sometimes sellers or offerees get so offended by a lowball that that's what they say. They don't even want to counter it. And that's when your counsel mode as an agent kicks in and you try to encourage them. Well, look, let's maybe generate some momentum. It might be more useful and beneficial to you if we give them something to go by. If they lowballed, at the very least, let's highball, right? If that's the thing, let's just come off a little bit from the price or come down a little bit. So they could reject, they could counter, reject and counter. They could revoke it. At any point up until the other party accepts the offer, you could say, never mind, I would now revoke it. It's no longer valid. If they don't accept it by the time the deadline has come and gone, there's not always a deadline, but you could choose to put one. And if you did, 1 second past that deadline, time is of the essence, is enough to kill it, and it's no longer in effect. And if the acceptance is not communicated in a reasonable time, this is not about the deadline. This is saying this, forget there's a deadline at all. You've made an offer, and it's been 2 weeks since you've heard anything from the other agent or the seller. You might be wondering what's going on, right? You might have even started wondering that after the second or third day. So is that a reasonable time to still be wondering if they're going to accept it a week later or even 4 or 5 days later? Probably not. Would a judge decide that's reasonable? I would dare say no. I bet a reasonable time is more like in the 2 to 3 day range. They don't give us a specific number, but a week or two, probably far outside of that reasonable time definition. And then if the offeror or the offeree dies in shock at how terrible this offer is, I'm just kidding, dies of some method or other, then this offer is off the table. There is no offer anymore. This whole thing goes away. Communicating to an agent is the same as communicating to the client. Yeah, not the customer. It would be communicating to a sub-agent is not the same as communicating to their customer. You have to make sure the customer knows before it can be considered under contract in that event. But this one is about if they have an actual buyer agent. We saw all the addenda. Let's take a look at this one. Let me see here. Okay, good. Yeah, this point we're just kind of reviewing most of what we've already covered. There's a couple little nuances that we do need to highlight, but let's look at this potential test question. It might be hard to read. Let me use the full screen here. On Monday, the sellers tell their agent that they have accepted and signed the buyer's offer. The listing agent tells the buyer's agent that they mailed the contract to the buyer's home address. Ew, gross, but they could. The earnest money was to be delivered within 3 days of acceptance. On Tuesday, the sellers changed their mind about selling the house. The paperwork has not yet arrived at the buyer's home address, and the earnest money has not arrived to the seller's address. The listing agent emailed the buyer agent to let them know that the sellers have changed their mind and instructed to the buyer to destroy the offer to purchase when it does arrive. Which of the following is true? Is it true that the sellers can unilaterally terminate since the contract's not valid until the money is received? Or the sellers can unilaterally terminate because the party has 3 days to rescind? Or the sellers may not unilaterally terminate because they have to give the buyer until the end of due diligence period? Or they may not unilaterally terminate because a binding sales contract exists. Best answer.
4.
Anyone else? Everybody agree to that? This is a good example too, because we've been through this so nice and freshly and successfully that you're exactly right. This is also a great example of, if you know enough about the topic, you can weed out the nonsense answers. And really, all 3 of these are nonsense answers. There are other reasons that we know that's not the right answer, other than that 4 is the right answer, right? So can they unilaterally terminate because it's not valid until the money is received? The contract's validity is never about the money in possession. Just because the due diligence money hasn't been received by the seller doesn't mean that contract is not a contract. That's a big distinction that we talk about a lot in update courses. And unilaterally, because there's a 3-day right of rescission, there's no such thing as that. There are a couple possibilities of rights of rescission. It could be rescinded at any time before acceptance. That's a thing. But in this case, the contract was already signed. There's also a 7-day right of rescission in the event that we're buying a what? What type of property brings with it a 7-day right of rescission? Condo.
New condo. New construction.
Perfect. Yeah, not resale, just a new condo, 7-day right of rescission. And then there's one that's a 5-day right of rescission. Which one is a 5-day right of rescission? It's sort of a very unique kind of part of the business that I've never really run across anybody who's in part of. But a timeshare has a built-in 5-day, but there is no 3. So that's easy to cross that one out. And then have to give the buyer till the end of due diligence. We know better than that. So good example of how test-taking strategy could also be useful. You might even be kind of weak in the topic, but because you definitely know how to rule out 1, 2, and 3, or even most questions, you can probably get it down to a 50-50 chance. Weed out 2 of the 4 answers and get down to at least a coin flip. We talked about all of these addenda, so we're not going to belabor the point, except to remind you that the additional provisions could provide for a deadline of the offer, tenants, and lease paperwork, and security deposit, septic system needing to perk, any improvements the buyer wants to build in, manufactured housing, VIN numbers, pool maintenance, and then that new one about if there's another garage or a boat slip. That was been added since I made this slide. The FHA VA financing protections created by that addenda lets the borrower, pay attention to this one, terminate the offer to purchase and contract after the end of the due diligence period without giving up their earnest money. They have the special privilege that those of us not using a VA loan don't have. If we back out after due diligence period, we're having to lose the earnest money. But because this addendum is built into it, they don't. They have the entire period, even after due diligence, the entire under contract period to back out because maybe it didn't appraise. That'd be a big reason for it, without losing the earnest money. This is a special privilege given to FHA and VA borrowers. And if it doesn't appraise for the purchase price, survives the due diligence period. Oh, by the way, no addenda, no financing contingency. This is essentially a financing contingency, right? If they can't have it appraised, then they don't have to buy it and they can get their earnest money back. They still lose the due diligence money, by the way. But unless they have this specific addendum built in and signed, this protection doesn't exist. In other words, just because they're using FHA loan or a VA loan doesn't give them the protection. Incorporating this addendum is what gives them the protection. So you have a duty for reasonable skill and care, right? Part of your Fiduciary duties, part of that is knowing I better get this thing signed so I can give my buyer this additional coverage of protection, this additional addendum that puts that in place for them to be able to back out after due diligence and get their earnest money back. Backup contract addendum, you can be the next in line. The buyer wants a home that's already under contract. They can at the very least be next in line. And the notice that they have been moved from the secondary position, the backup position, to the primary position needs to be in writing, and it is final. While this exists, while this is in place, your buyer better be okay with at any moment being told you are now the primary buyer. If they want to back out, I've had it where they have this backup contract addendum in place, and we keep looking at houses. They say, well, we're disappointed. Can we keep looking? And I say, yeah, okay. And we look around and we find one, and they're walking through it and their eyes are lighting up and they're like, oh, wow, we don't even care about that garbage we had a backup contract for. This is great. What should you do in that moment when you realize your client is really into this one and they don't care about that one anymore? What if just as they're about to want to write an offer, you get a call from the listing agent on that one that says, congratulations, our buyer walked away. You are now the primary buyer. Let's not let that happen. In that case, they've got to give them due diligence money right away. And so they're sad because now they're obligated to give money to that seller while they really want to buy this new one. So the first thing to do when they fall in love with a new house is to cancel that other one. Let's rescind it. Let's withdraw the offer before we get a notification that they have been moved to the primary position. This is not a thing anymore. There used to be a contingent sale addendum where the buyer needed to sell a house in order to buy this house, but we don't have a standard form for that anymore. We used to. It just stopped being used because it was frankly a little bit awkward and hard to understand for people. And so we also, in the meantime, adopted this due diligence period, due diligence fee concept from 12 or 13 years ago. And so now when you have a house that needs to sell in order to buy another house, we pretty much just pad the due diligence period with enough time to make sure that one can get under contract and maybe even close before we committed to buy this one. And ultimately, worst case scenario, it doesn't get under contract. Your buyer can just walk away because they can walk for any reason or no reason, as long as they're willing to walk away from that due diligence fee, but maybe still keep the earnest money or get that back. If they do want to build in something more than that, an actual contingent sale addendum with some kind of special language, we wouldn't write it. An attorney would need to write it. Get an attorney to draft a custom one to suit their needs. We know about lead-based paint. We just talked about it. I won't belabor that point. Some procedures. If offerors and offerees want to add a condition to an offer that is not already in there, they would use what? How do we modify when it's an offer stage?
Amendment.
Careful though. Offer, not contract.
Addendum.
I'm kind of glad you did that because it's so easy to get caught up in the test and think, I know the answer. Anytime, I'm going to give you a list of red flags, like red flag topics to be watching out for. If you see them show up on the test, this is one of them. Anytime you see words or test questions about offer versus contract or agency like buyer agent versus sub agent, make sure you are very clear in your brain before you look for the answers in the choices what we are talking about. So pause, read back through and say, wait a minute, is this about the offer phase or is this about the contract phase? That is a huge difference. So it's about the offer phase and you quickly recovered the fumble and you're like, yeah, oh, okay, right, addenda. So just watch out for certain suspicious test question topics that might be easy to confuse the various stages we're in. The acceptable manner, let's see, all offers must be disclosed or submitted to the seller or the offeree, I should say, not necessarily the seller, immediately. So if you see a test question that says, when should an agent submit an offer to their client? And the answer choices are immediately, within 3 days, within 5 days, or within 7 days. Out of those 4 answers, the best choice is immediately. But What if the answer choices are, instead of no immediately at all, when does a broker have to give the offers to their client? Within 3 days, 5, 7, or 9. In that case, the best answer choice is 3. But in general, in real life, in the wild, disclose all offers immediately, but no later than 3 days from the date of the offer. We can never accept or reject an offer on behalf of our client, or we can't screen offers either. Let me paint a scenario. What if your client is grumpy? Sometimes the client is not fun to work with. They're mean, they're grumpy. They say things like, I don't even want to consider an offer below 700,000. Don't waste my time, Neil. If this offer comes in below 7, only show me offers of above 700,000. And then you get an offer. You get 5 offers. 4 of them are for 7, 715, 720 in that range, and then one of them is for 680. And you're so tired of this seller just making your ears bleed because of how mean they are. It would be tempting to only show them the 4 good ones and not even tell them about the 680. And the attitude might be, well, they're not going to accept the 680 anyway. Why should I even bother? I don't want to deal with the abuse. You have to. You've got to present all offers. It might even be, by the way, that 680 was just somebody fishing, hoping for the best, who actually very quickly would rise to the very best, right? Tried to lowball, because some people can't help themselves. They just have to try a ridiculously low offer. But it could have turned out that maybe the financing on that one was better than the other 4. Maybe it was a cash sale instead of a loan, and you didn't even have to wait for the loan to be approved. That might be more attractive to your client, your seller, and they like that idea better, in which case they say, well, I really like this idea of a cash offer. And it would make sense that a cash offer would be the lowest offer, because a lot of times a cash buyer thinks they can make a super low offer just because of the privilege of not having to deal with the loan approval. But your strategy is, a seller, if you really like the cash offer more than all these other ones that you're using financing, let's see what we can do. Let's counter them. And I know they're offering 680 and you want at least 700, but let's counter. And the best offer on the table that is maybe an FHA or a VA loan, which isn't perfect because your roof is old and we're worried that the FHA appraiser might not allow the roof and it could cause the whole thing to fall apart. And that one is the highest offer at 715. Heck, let's counter that 680 cash offer with 720 or 715. See what happens. And then if they give a response and they say no, and we can't work it out, we'll go to one of those other ones, as long as it's within the reasonable time frame, right? So there's a lot of ways we could handle a multiple offer situation. Speaking of that, we could also use that thing called a response to buyer's offer form that we looked at. The thing that says, this is a rejection, not a counter, but we would look favorably upon the following changes. So all kinds of possibilities. You could also do neither of those and just say to the whole world, bring us all your offers by Sunday at 5 and we'll let you know. If you give a deadline like that and you've got 20 offers that show up by Sunday at 5, is your seller required to accept one of them? Or are they allowed to keep considering offers that arrive after that deadline you set?
Well, they could counter all of them, so they don't necessarily have to accept any of them.
Okay, let's talk about that. What if they countered all of them at the same? Are you talking about at the same time?
Well, I'm not necessarily certain if it would be all at the same time, but as they came in, let's just say you had already determined that, you know, maybe there was another buyer that you wanted to go with outside of all these offers.
Right.
Why not just counter all of them with a ridiculous number and maybe try to warrant a rejection somehow or something like that?
So I appreciate the creativity and the thought. You just need to be careful about count. You couldn't, if you counted all of them, what's the worst case that could happen? All of them accept. And now you can't replicate. Let's just make it more reasonable, like 5 competing offers. You can't make 5 additional exact perfect houses now times 5. You don't have 5 houses. So rather than counter, maybe the better choice would be to counter none of them, make suggestions to all of them. Maybe that's what you were getting at. and say, this is not a counter, it's a rejection, but we would look favorably upon these changes. Let's see if they'll bring us back something stronger. And out of all those 5 that you say try again, maybe one says, forget you, I'm out of here. I don't even believe there's multiple offers. A lot of times you have skepticism from at least one. And then the other 4, maybe one of them stands firm and says, this is the best I can do. And then the other 3 improve in some way. And now maybe it's a little easier. Now it's a 3-way consideration for your seller. The one went away, the one didn't improve. You got 3 better ones. I've even used this form like 3 times in a row, because every time we told them to try again, they all came up about the same exact amount. And it's almost embarrassing. And you kind of almost feel bad as a listing agent. I'm sorry. I know, guys, I promise I'm not lying to you, but you've all come up again. The seller wants to see who's going to like come out in the lead. And so here's your chance yet again to make a revised offer, if you want to revise your offer, kind of thing.
Hey, Neil, can we backtrack a second?
Yeah, sure
I
thing.
need to make sure I understand something
Definitely.
as far as the addendum amendment thing, because, okay, my thought process on that is if the offer to purchase eventually turns into a contract once it's accepted, isn't that like pretty much the same thing if you want to make any change? So once I'm in the under contract phase or the offer phase, if I want to make any changes to the current offer, that's an addendum. But
Right.
once I accept the contract or accept the offer, which puts it into contract phase, anything after that is an amendment.
Exactly right. That's right. It's about what is this thing you're changing. If you're changing the thing when it's a contract, then we're going to use an amendment to do that. If we're changing the thing while it's still an offer, or not so much changing, when we're dealing with an offer, we're adding maybe extra pieces to that offer. It's not just going to serve us to use the 2T. We also need the FHA addendum. We also need the additional provisions addendum because we want to put a deadline. We need maybe whatever else, right? So that's the difference. Does that make more sense? When it's the offer stage, it's not that we're changing the offer. Usually, it's that we can't accomplish the buyer's intended goal with just the basic 2T contract alone. We need to add extra addenda to it to customize it more to their liking.
So pretty much the addendum is designed to meet the requirements that would push it into a contract.
Yeah, to make that offer whatever your buyer client wants it to be, so as to hopefully increase our chances of getting accepted. Yeah. Is that good?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Great. Always, anytime, definitely reach out and ask for those sorts of things. We're going to go ahead and take our break. I'll see you back here in 10, and we'll finish this out. Okay, welcome back. So let's talk about offers to purchase and counter offers. The offeree who has received an offer makes a change that is now constituting a rejection. No matter how small the change is, that's a testable item too. So an offeror makes an offer, and they submit that offer to the offeree, and the offeree says, "Oh, I like the price, I like most of the terms, but this closing date of May 13th, I can't close on that date. That's my hamster's birthday. I could close on the 14th, but not the 13th." So they proceed to strike through the closing date proposal, settlement date, change it, initial it. What has just happened? What if the offeror says, "No, sorry, that's just, I can't do the 14th. The 13th is where it has to be." We have a rejection and a counter proposal. Could the seller then say, "Well, okay. The buyer gets mad and says, "I'm out of here. Forget it." Could the seller say, "Okay, I'll honor your first offer"? Is that buyer going to have to resort to that original offer they made, or are they free to go because it was rejected?
They're free to go because it was rejected.
Any change, no matter how tiny the change, is a rejection. That's why we need to have a good talk with our client and say, "I know you want to customize this to your exact desire, but let's give some weight to this thing. Do we really want to give them the option to walk away from this?" And in real life, the way I would handle that is, if it were a big enough deal for like a closing date question, I'd say, let's don't give them any counter, and I'll call the agent and I'll say, just kind of get an idea of how serious this thing is to your client. Are they super committed to that closing date? Or would they consider something else? This is not a counter. This is not a rejection. We're just feeling around trying to find out what sort of wiggle room we might have. That'd be a way I would handle it in real life, so as not to make an official, here's what we want 14th, not 13th, in which case they could walk away and you couldn't get them back necessarily. It's also the case that they may very well say, "Yeah, okay, we can go back to that one," but they would have to give you permission to resort to the original one. It's not automatic. Shopping offers, not allowed. Whose permission do you need? If that buyer agent calls you and says, "Hey, I like that listing. My client really likes it. We had that class together with that weird instructor, bald guy, and I'd love to work with you. What's the highest offer on the table that I need my client to be able to make a higher offer than? How much do we need to beat? You have multiple offers. What's the best offer? What do we need to come in better than?" Whose permission would you need to answer that question of what's the highest offer on the table?
The seller.
That's a great guess. But 90% of all update students who are licensed for many years oftentimes get it wrong too. That is not the permission you need. That's not for the seller to give us permission about telling the highest offer on the table. It's the one who made the highest offer. We would have to get permission from them, but you never would. Nobody's that dumb. Nobody would say, "Here's what it's going to take to beat me. Go ahead and disclose my offer so everybody can make a better one." Do like a Price is Right thing and $1 over kind of thing. Nobody's going to give you that permission, but that's whose permission you would need. The other question is, are there multiple offers on this listing? That is for the sellers. That is the seller's right to give permission for that one. And I get it all the time. I ask it in every update course, and most people don't get that right. They think it's the seller's permission that you need for both of those questions. So
when you have to once you have that high offer, wouldn't you have to, as the agent, disclose that information to the seller?
Yeah. Oh yeah. As the listing agent, you're going to tell and present the offer ASAP immediately. And so the seller,
So wouldn't it put the power back in the seller's hand now at that point? Because if somebody else comes with a higher offer, or you mean just simply giving that information, disclosing the information?
Disclosing it to the other agents. That's what I'm talking about. So let me paint this scenario. You have received a call from a buyer agent. You're the listing agent, and that buyer agent says, "Are there multiple offers?" So first of all, whose permission do you need to answer that question? you need your seller's permission to disclose whether or not there are multiple offers. And if they say no, and I don't want my sellers to give me that permission, I want to be able to answer that this way. Hey, buyer agent, my seller has not given me permission to disclose that if there's multiple offers or not. I want to do that just in case their buyer happens to be tired of having to compete with multiple offers on every house they try. I don't want to discourage them from trying on this one. And so I can give them a non-answer, and it's allowable because my seller gave me permission to say basically, no, I'm not telling. I don't have to tell. But then if they go further and say, okay, so there might be multiple offers, you're not able to tell me, I get that. What offer is the best one? What do we need to come in with? What's the highest offer that we need to beat? That's the permission you would need is from whoever has the highest offer on the table. The buyer who has made that offer is the permission you would need. Your seller knows all of these offers, right? Because you're talking to them and presenting to them as you get them. So does that help, or did I miss the nuance of your question?
No, you didn't miss it. I mean, I understand, but it still seems a little bit confusing as to, how the real estate commission chose to lay that out like that, because it seems like once, as the seller, it seems like ultimately I would have the power.
You do.
And let's just say I was curious and I wanted to know what they were trying to come in with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, the seller does know this. So the seller does know how much all those offers are. It's just that if another buyer agent asks me how much the highest offer on the table is, I can't tell them the answer to that. Even if the seller wanted me to, I wouldn't be allowed to. The seller says, yeah, I don't care. Go ahead and tell them that the highest offer is currently $850. That's not whose permission I would need. I'd have to say to my seller, I'm sorry, thanks for giving me that permission, but it's not your permission I need to tell everybody what the highest offer is. It's the permission of that one person who made this $850 offer that I would need, that I'll never get, because they're not so dumb as to give me permission to tell everybody what it's going to take for them to lose. Does that help better?
Yeah, but it still seems like I'm eliminating an opportunity to find out what a potentially higher offer could be.
Why do you say that?
Because I'm not giving, I don't have, like you said, the highest offerer.
I see. I think I get it now.
Is not gonna, say, yeah, go ahead and let them know, because they don't want to get outbid. But you know what I mean?
Yeah. So you're saying that there would be a lot of value and benefit to the seller if we could basically let people shop offers and say, here's the one to beat. Everybody come up to this level. And I get that. You're right. That probably would help in a lot of cases. And it would at least rule out people that aren't willing to come up that high. It's sort of like a bidding thing, an auction sort of a thing. But this isn't that. We don't have an auction style that we're doing in this moment. And in that case, we're not allowed to do it. Shopping of offers, not allowed. At best, yes, it possibly would help, and maybe even the seller would prefer it, but it's not in the rules. We're not allowed to. So all we can do is say, hey, buyer agents, we could do a couple things. We could receive those multiple offers, and don't forget that form we saw, the response to buyer's offer. While we can't tell the whole world the highest offer to beat, we could tell each individual offeror and say, here's what you need to do to make yours better so that the seller would reconsider and maybe accept yours. And that could have that highest offer number in it. We just can't say that that's what it is. Right. In the response to buyer's offer, we could say, here's what it would take for us to really seriously think about choosing you. And it could be the 850 as that's the number that it needs to beat. But we can't say because this is the number that is the highest offer. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that. You pretty much
it's just the confines
giving the information
of the
without saying that you're giving the information.
Right. And side note, you could totally bluff using that response to buyer's offer form, and you could say, well, I kind of want at least 850. The highest offer is 845. Let me just tell everybody, or tell this one person or whoever I want to with this response form. Seller would look favorably if you come back with 925. You could skyrocket it if you wanted to, and if you thought you could get away with it, and nobody's going to know the difference. You're never going to have to prove it to them, because if they win, well, they'll find out maybe later if they lose. But if they win by coming up to the 9 something, they'll never know. All they'll ever see is in the archives, this sold for the price they paid because they were the winner. But if they don't win, eventually it'll show up in the MLS. It could be found as a sold, and they'll see, oh, they ended up getting $856 for it, which is all irrelevant, doesn't matter. But they would find out later that for some reason you took an offer at $856. But keep in mind too, it's more than just the price. There are other terms of the offer that might be attractive to someone, including timing, type of financing, other items that are being asked for that they don't want to give up or that they do want to give up and not have to move. So it's more than it is price and terms and dates that people are looking at too. But you make a good point. Shopping of offers would possibly and maybe even probably result in higher offers. All of that said, we could have these, and we had it these last 5 years or so, and all these update courses I teach, I asked the question, and they're saying they've seen over asking price offers as much as 50,000 over asking price, 100,000 over asking price, 200,000 over asking price. So what do you have to worry about when we get an offer over asking price by that much? Is it going to appraise? Are there enough similar comps that have sold recently nearby, similar house with adjustments made? Can we justify that price? And that's only if it's a finance thing that you're trying to use financing for it. If you're paying cash, you don't care if it appraises. You just want to win it, maybe, right? So all of those moving parts become a part of the thing to consider for your client. So mainly for our purposes here, super simple. The test question is just going to say, basically, they'll probably present a scenario, but essentially the question is, whose permission would you need to disclose the highest offer? The one who made it. Or whose permission would you need to disclose that there are multiple offers? The seller's permission for that one. It won't get more complicated than that. Also, if you do tell one person or one party or one buyer agent that yes, there are multiple offers, you have to make that the answer you give everybody. You can't tell one person one thing and someone else the other. You got to keep it fair amongst everybody. So if your answer is yes, there's multiples, everybody has to be told yes. And another thing about documentation, we know that we have to keep all the files, all the communication, all the advertising screenshots for 3 years after the end of the transaction. We also have to provide everybody, our clients, the things that they sign, the documents, the offers within 3 days, immediately ideally, but not later than 3 days after execution. So we're required through this rule to provide all parties with anything they sign immediately, no later than 3 days later. Why 3 days? It goes back to the old-fashioned days when mail was used a lot. We drop it in the mail to them. We don't mail things to people anymore. We're going to scan them and email them or DocuSign them electronically and shoot it over immediately. But the 3 days is still just built in because of the old snail mail methods. We could have a lot of changes, in which case it could look super messy like this and hard to read. It gets to a certain point and you're wondering, what does this mean? Why is this here? Is this a yes or a no? Or does this replace that? And it gets convoluted, in which case it would be better to rewrite it fresh. By the time you go back and forth with counteroffers, rather than strike through stuff, let's just make it nice and neat and clean and write it as if it was never changed with the most recent terms, most recently acceptable terms, and get that signed by everybody. So it's crispy, perfectly reasonable to understand. Offerors, offerees, parties to the transaction want to change something or add a condition to a contract, not an offer, but a contract. What would they use for that?
Amendment.
An amendment, not an addendum. Exactly right. True or false, multiple offers should be delivered in the order they are received so the offeree can consider each one in the proper order. What do you think? Does the order received, should that matter in terms of the weight they give to the multiple offers?
I would say false. I don't see why it would matter.
Exactly right. The commission says that too. They say don't give more preferential treatment just because somebody got there first, right? Offers are offers. Submit them as you get them. This doesn't mean that you're just supposed to wait by the phone, wait by the email inbox, and just be there to immediately send them as soon as they come. You've got a life, you've got a business. And so maybe you went to the movies, maybe you're in a listing appointment, and you come out of that and you're like, oh, here's 3 more offers. Shoot them over all at the same time. Just send. You don't need to say this one I got at 318 and this one at 420. None of that you should do. Just deliver them as soon as you get them. No particular order, just ASAP within reason, right? Again, you're not expected to wait by the computer and just wait for these offers so that you can pass them along. Now, last bit of this chapter, we learned about an option to purchase. And now we're going to talk about 2 more things that look sort of like an option to purchase. So you need to have all 3 of them kind of straight in your mind. The option to purchase, remember, I think Alfred reminded us yesterday that is a unilateral contract, an example of a unilateral agreement where one party has made a promise, not both. And the promise made is by the seller saying, yep, I'm going to sit here and wait for you, buyer, to decide if you want to buy it or not. One direction, one promise. The buyer's not having to say, I promise to buy it or I promise not to buy it. They still can think about it. That is not something we would use. An option to purchase is not something we would use if we are a renter who might possibly want to buy the house we're renting. We're going to use one of these other things if we're a renter and want to accomplish this goal. And those other things are called preemptive rights. So we're going to learn about preemptive rights here in a moment. And the other thing in this section is a very specific kind of seller financing called an installment land contract. Anytime you see that big long phrase, that's all it is. The seller is saying, I don't want all my money up front. I'm okay with receiving it in monthly payments. Basically, I will be the seller. I'll be the bank. Pay me every month with a mortgage payment because I am the mortgage I'd be the mortgagee. The mortgagor would be the one buying. So in this case of seller financing with an installment land contract, the seller keeps the deed, retains the legal title. The buyer has equitable title, meaning they get to possess it, use it. And then legal and deed and legal title will transfer once that debt is finally all paid off. Could be a 30-year loan, 20, 15, 10. It should be recorded. Doesn't have to be, but it should be in order to protect against third parties claiming that they have some sort of ownership. And then it's that weird one where the parties involved have unrelated words, titles. The seller is the vendor, the buyer's the vendee, vendor and vendee. That's all you need about the installment land contract, except this. It's hard on the buyer when you have to foreclose on them, right? They've lived there. They've been trying to buy it. Foreclosure is never easy, but it's particularly tough on the buyer in a seller financing situation. They're forfeiting the payments they've made. Maybe some of those payments were credited toward the purchase. They're losing that, and they're losing the property itself, plus any profits they might have made on being able to sell it instead of having to lose it to foreclosure. The option to purchase that we've talked about already involves a fee. The buyer, potential buyer, the optionee, receiving the option to buy or not, pays a fee for the privilege of asking that seller to wait for them to make a decision. They have to stay off the property. With an option to purchase, it's not a renter situation. They don't get to occupy it or use it or possess it. They are staying away from it, but they have an option to decide whether they want to buy it. This is a case where you live in your house, wherever that is, and you say, oh, that land over there, that's where they might put the road that's going to cross the interstate. And so that might become more valuable once all that goes through. Let me get an option to purchase signed by the seller so I have the right to buy it if that zoning vote or the highway strategic location of where the highway is going to go, if that vote goes in my favor, then I want to buy it. But if all that gets struck down, I don't want to buy it. It's not going to be worth as much. That's what you're waiting for. And while you're waiting to figure all this out, you're living somewhere else. It might even be more likely to be a land thing that we're using this for. But the main thing is you don't occupy the property during this option period. You're paying for the privilege of having time to decide to buy it or not. And it needs to be recorded to be enforceable. And the optionor, the seller, potential seller, cannot terminate it. They've got to wait and see what you want to do. That's an option to purchase, not a rental situation. You're not renting to own or rent with option to buy. If you want to be a renter and possibly buy it, it's going to be one of the two preemptive rights that you might use. And there are two possibilities. One of these preemptive rights is called a right of first refusal. The seller is not promising to sell it. You're just saying, hey, seller, if you ever get an offer from someone who wants to buy this, give me a chance to beat it. And by having this right of first refusal in writing, you've got the automatic right for that. In other words, if they get an offer, they have to come to you and say, I got an offer. Are you willing to beat it? In this case, you have a chance to match that offer, and the price can be negotiated at a future date with a right of first refusal because you don't know what that potential offer might be. It hasn't come in yet. It may never come in. So you don't necessarily, and by the way, you could have either of these preemptive rights and still not be a renter. But if you are a renter, it would be one of these two things as instead of the option to purchase arrangement. But again, not only for renters, but it could be. So again, it could be that seller doesn't want to sell. They don't want to let you buy it necessarily, but if someone else comes in and makes them an offer, if you have this right of first refusal in place, they have to give you a chance to meet or beat that before they honor and accept that offer from someone else. The other choice, other kind of preemptive right is a right of first opportunity to purchase. In this case, you're saying, hey, owner, if you ever decide to sell, not that an offer came in for it, but you just decide you want to sell later, you'll let me have a chance to buy it. In this case, this is the difference between this and the other one. The price is established when this first opportunity to purchase agreement is signed. We determine the price up front for this one. We determine the price later for the one where it's first refusal. Somebody made an offer and now we have the chance to beat that offer. So that's essentially the only thing. That's all there is to it about preemptive rights. Just know the difference. Either one of these could involve a renter living in the house while they have the right of first refusal or while they have the opportunity to purchase, but they don't have to. They could also be a non-renter. This one, option to purchase, they have to stay off the property. This is not for a renter. So, true or false, in an option to purchase, the tenant has the right to decide whether they want to buy the property at a future date.
True.
Careful. Let's think about which one out of the three, the two preemptive rights versus the option to purchase, is it for a renter or not? Can you be a renter occupying this property when you have an option to purchase? That's this one.
No, that's false.
There you go. If it were a renter situation, it'd have to be one of these. These are pretty much like this. They're pretty much like an option. It's just that there's a little bit of a nuance, a little difference, and they can be the renter situation. So yeah, this one is sort of a trick question because we use the word tenant. So it's kind of pushing you in a direction. So sorry about that. So our summation of this thing is all offers must be submitted to the seller immediately, no later than 3 days. Multiple offers must be submitted to the seller immediately. Don't screen. Give them as soon as you get them. The seller has to give you permission to tell whether to tell the world that there are multiple offers. It's not a material fact that you owe to everybody. It's up to the seller to decide based on your advice to them. And then if you have a lot of changes during the negotiation, type it up nice and new and fresh. Have everybody sign the new fresh version so it's not confusing. We don't have to worry about it being legible, illegible, hard to read, or hard to understand. That is 10. And let's go on into financing and get this one out of the way so you can take your midterm next week. It's another high test question topic. So it's pretty deep. And Unit 14 we've got some learning objectives, the different kind of financing that's out there. What is this thing called? A primary mortgage market versus a secondary mortgage market. The three main types of mortgage loans and some other special purpose ones. The different practices, lending practices and procedures involved in residential lending, the federal financing legislation and what they're involved with. So our level one are the primary and secondary markets, monetary policy, all surface level, pretty fundamental, basic level understanding of these things. Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the lender has to follow certain things. They can't refuse a loan to certain situations. Another one of them is age. You can't turn down 105-year-old granny from getting a 30-year mortgage. That's illegal. That's under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, for instance. Special purpose mortgage, USDA loans. Level two, specifically the differences between the top three, conventional, FHA, and VA, the priority of mortgage liens legislation. And so, yeah, quite a double-digit number of questions coming from this topic on the Pearson exam. So when it comes to finance, think about any time you ever borrowed money. We're just going to go basic for now. Forget, yes, the mortgage follows suit, but, oh, sorry, gosh, I wasn't showing you anything that whole time. Let me fix that. There we go. Here's all that blabbity blab I was just giving you in those different levels, 1, 2, etc. So when there is a loan, you're borrowing money, there's both the loan amount or the principal loan amount, right? And there's the interest. The lender cares about the interest. That's their profit. That's what they're making. And it's why they are even willing to do this thing, because they want to make money off of you for the privilege of you borrowing their money. So we've got the principal, which is paid down over time. You owe less as you make your payments. Every payment decreases the principal loan amount. And as you're paying down that principal loan amount, it's that much more equity that you have in the property. The word equity, your part. What are you left with once you sell it and pay off all your debts, all the expenses of selling? That's your equity. Equity can go up over time. We hope it does. It tends to. And there's various reasons why that happens, and we'll see that in a minute. So again, principal is the amount you've borrowed. The interest is how much you're paying for the privilege of borrowing it. Another way to say this is that if you borrow $300,000 to buy that house, you're going to be paying back way more than $300,000 because that interest accumulates. And if you see an amortization schedule, let's see here, let me do one real quick. I wanted to show what that total is you would be paying off real quick. I don't have one close at hand. Might have it here. There's when you sign off on your mortgage at closing, they'll show you an actual printed out table that says, here's what you will have paid by the time you pay this entire loan off. And it's a disturbing number. It's like, well, there we go. This kind of gives you an idea. This is saying that if you were to borrow $300,000 for a 30-year loan term, let's just go by 7% because that's closer to the current rate. 7% right over my head. The monthly payment based on the interest rate and some other things is about $2,000 a month. The total amount you will have paid for borrowing $300,000 at 7%, $718,000. And so, yeah, that lender wants to get that interest from you. It's going to take them 30 years to get it all because you're making that payment of $19.95 a month for 30 years, 360 payments. So that's kind of the idea. The good thing to do to make a bunch of money is be the bank. Have enough money to loan it to people at an interest rate and just make some money on that, right? This is also a chart that shows how much, based on the interest rate, would your monthly payment be. we're going to have to do that math and learn how do we calculate the monthly principal and interest depending on the rate and the term of the loan. And it's not as hard as it sounds. But anytime you see these sorts of calculators on the internet, on a website or an actual calculator, that's all it's doing. We're going to learn how to do this by hand, not so much by hand, but with a simple calculator, with a pretty simple multiplication exercise and determine this stuff that this does automatically by plugging into the fields. So we'll get to that. Here we are. Okay. So that's principal and interest. When we run into this with mortgages, we're going to sometimes see a phrase refers to it called debt service. Anytime you see the phrase debt service, it means the monthly payment of principal and interest. So every month when you have a mortgage, you're paying a single payment. In that one case we just saw, $1,995. In the early stages, probably the entire first half of the 30-year term, if it's a 30-year loan term, you've got a $1,995 monthly payment. Part of that's going to go toward your principal to pay down your debt, and part of that payment every month is going toward the interest profit to the lender. What stays consistent is the $1,995. If it's an amortized, fully amortized loan, we'll see what that means in a minute. So out of this $1,995, that doesn't change. And that's nice. Buyers want to know stability. They want to know that they're not going to have a month of $2,250 and then another month of $1,600. A nice, steady, same every month. But what does change over time is that in the first half of this loan, let's say the very first month you pay this mortgage payment of $1,995, probably $1,993 is being put toward the interest, in other words, profit to the lender, and only $2 is lowering your principal loan balance. Vastly lopsided in the beginning, and they do that, front load it, right? The lender wants to do that because they know you're probably going to pay this thing off sooner than 30 years. So over time, your loan is going to go down to zero. It's going to be all the way up here at whatever that loan amount was. I guess $300,000 is what we just saw. And then finally down to zero at the end. You're paying that off over time. And so the proportion of principal to interest changes over time. Around this 15-year mark, 15 years, that's 30 years, that's the first year. Around this point, when you make a monthly payment, the principal that's being paid down by that monthly payment is probably more like around $1,000. And then the interest going to that lender is also about $1,000. It's about even. And then it starts to go the other direction. The second half of the loan term, now you're really happy because now your principal is getting paid off quicker and the interest going to the lender is less. So every month, incrementally, this thing happens. How much comes off your principal versus how much goes into the pocket of the bank that you borrowed the money from. So that's sort of what's happening behind the scenes through this process of paying your mortgage payment, the principal and interest called debt service. You could also, the interest itself, the part that's going toward interest, that doesn't affect your principal at all. That's just profit to the lender. It doesn't increase your equity either. When you have, let's fast forward to maybe the 10th year of ownership with this mortgage. And let's say we're in that 10th year out of 30. And let's say our payment, it's the $1,995 as it has been every month. The principal versus the interest is changing over time. But let's say by now, that original loan amount that we had when we originally borrowed $300,000, we've paid that down. It's not paid off yet, but let's just say, I have no idea what it would be after this 10th year, but let's just say now this original loan amount is now down to the current loan amount of $200,000. What else may have happened is that your property that you paid, let's say you paid $350,000 for it. That was the original price, sale price, 10 years ago. Well, guess what? A lot has happened in the last 10 years. Now your current market value has gone up to $600,000. Congratulations. Welcome to a seller's market. Welcome to low inventory. Welcome to real life, because this is not unusual right now. So your market value of the property has gone up significantly. You've paid the loan down from 300 down to 200, and maybe even you did some fix-ups. Maybe you added another garage. Maybe you finished out the basement. And so you did what are called capital improvements. You did things to make the property more valuable. And so maybe you made it more valuable to the tune of another $50,000. So that part would probably be reflected when you did your research to see what are houses like this selling for. You're saying, oh, houses like this with this upgraded basement finished out are worth $600,000. That's partly because of the capital improvements you've put in. So let's just acknowledge that the capital improvements have affected this number. What's going to happen if you sell this thing now, 10 years later? You're going to get $600,000 for the price. You're going to have an expense of $200,000 that you still owe to the lender. You used to owe $300,000. You bought it down, paid it down to that. You're going to have $400,000, not including paying the broker fee, not including paying other closing costs. Let's say all that stuff is another $50,000, so you could walk away with $350,000. That is your equity. Well, actually, the $400,000 is your equity because you chose to spend money out of that equity and hire the broker. So your equity is pretty much what the house is worth minus what you have to pay off to the lender. This is your equity. So the equity went up for 3 different reasons. Your equity can increase. What if you say, well, let me go ahead and put in a guest house, or add to the driveway, or put up a fence? All those things are more capital improvements that would increase your equity because they increase the value of the property. So capital improvements increase your equity. The appreciation of just the market, because typically real estate appreciates over time, no guarantees, but it tends to. And then also paying down the mortgage debt over time. All of that affects how much you end up putting in your pocket when you finally do sell it, the equity. So understanding interest, principal, and equity is important in this business, right? So the interest that you're paying is purely profit to the lender. It doesn't pull your loan balance down. It also doesn't increase your equity. It's just for the lender. How it benefits you is it gives them the motivation to make you the loan so that you could even buy it to begin with. And that brings us to this fun word, amortization. Amortization. The way you can remember it is the part within it called mort, M-O-R-T, like mortician or mortuary. Essentially, it's the death of the mortgage. Over time, this mortgage is going away. It is going down from the full duration, 30 years, maybe 20 years, all the way down to 0 years, at which point you've paid off that entire borrowed amount. It's a better looking version of what I explained already. Each payment pays off more principal. If your payment is $1,500 a month, the very first month, most of that $1,500 is going to go to the lender in profit as interest. A little teensy bit is going to pay down your loan. But then we get all the way to the end, and now a little bit of that $1,500 is going to go to profit to the lender. They already got most of it in the beginning. And then the rest of it is going to pay off your principal. Here's that midpoint of the amortization. Everything kind of becomes even around that 15-year mark. So again, your principal coming down by about half the mortgage payment amount, and then the interest paid to the lender about the same amount. And then it swaps. So now every payment after that midpoint 15-year mark, so roughly, is more coming off your loan amount than toward interest to the lender. We've got a couple of options. We've had different loan types amortized in different ways. A fully amortized loan eventually results in an amount of zero. And it's based on a couple of different rates. It could be based on a fixed mortgage rate, fixed interest rate. A fixed rate mortgage means that every payment's going to be the same and you're going to end up at zero at the end. An adjustable rate means the rate could change every so many years or from one year to the next. And it's going to be based on a financial index like a 10-year treasury bill or something. And the reason somebody might be willing to run the risk of an adjustable rate where they're not sure that their payment's going to stay the same is because it might be a way to get a lower payment in the beginning. It is an adjustable rate that gives them an affordable payment today for the first year, but then it might possibly adjust up or it could adjust down. Not for everybody. And a lot of people back in the years 2000 through 6, leading up to that catastrophe in 2007, 8, 9, did just this thing. They were sold by a lender the benefits of an adjustable rate. You can have a lower interest or mortgage payment if you just take the adjustable mortgage instead of the fixed rate mortgage. What could go wrong? I'm sure you'll get a raise by the time the adjustable might go up, and then they didn't. And then they had a much higher payment than they could even afford because they are already buying at the max that they could possibly afford, and that's part of why this whole thing came tumbling down. You could also have a payment that you make that is only going toward the interest. And so back in those days, in the 2000 era, you could have on your mortgage payment statement when they sent you the note in the mail, the lender, they could say, we have this new program and it's called a pick a pay payment. But if you need some help in a certain month because maybe times are hard, you can either pay the full $1,500 payment that covers the full amortization, meaning if you just keep paying $1,500 a month for the next whole duration of the loan, you'll go down to zero. It'll be all done. Or you could pay $1,200 a month. Would that be helpful to not have to pay an additional $300 a month? Well, we can make that happen for you. But what you need to know and what you had to find out by reading the fine print is that this $1,200 is only interest. And maybe 1 month it was helpful to have that $300 savings with an interest-only payment. But maybe people got a little used to it and they're like, wow, $300 this month, let's do it again next month and next month. And then they just kind of get used to it. And then all of a sudden a year goes by, and since all they did with that payment is pay interest, they never paid the loan balance. The loan amount, the loan balance stayed the same. It never goes away, never decreases if all you're doing is making an interest-only payment. And that is another thing that got people in trouble. They got hooked on the interest-only because it was a savings, but what it really was not making any progress. They were basically a renter. And so that was definitely a problem too. So fully amortized loan, there we go. First and last payment are the same amount. You end up in a loan balance of zero by the time that mortgage is over because it's amortized evenly and fully over the entire duration. A partially amortized loan means something else. That means that we're going to amortize it in a different way. All the payments except the last payment are going to be the same, but the very last and final payment is going to be higher or more or different. That last loan, the resulting remaining loan balance is the final payment 360 on a 30-year term. That's going to be what's called a balloon payment. What is a partially amortized loan? It's another way for a borrower who really can't afford this house to pretend like they can. And so with a partially amortized loan, it might look like this. Partially amortized. All the payments are $1,500 a month because let's go with that $1,500 as the full one. Let's say it's all the payments are $1,300 a month because we are partially amortizing. We're saying let's base it on a little bit of a lower rate, but we're going to give you the advantage of that lower rate with lower payments all the way till the last payment. and you're going to have to make a $10,000 payment on the 360th month to pay off the loan in full. All the payments are the same for 359 of them, most of those 30 years, but that 360th payment going to be disproportionately larger, because that's why the lender was able to give you that nice, low, easy to manage payment over the years, because they knew you were going to have to make this monster balloon payment, it's called. When that last payment is much bigger, it's called a balloon payment. And then, of course, as we saw already, interest only, nothing ever going toward the principal balance. If you're making an interest only payment, you will still owe the same loan balance for the duration that you've been making this interest only payment. If you only ever made an interest only payment, you'll never make progress. You're sort of like a renter. They love it. The lender loves it because they're getting profit all the time, and you're never lowering. It's going to take you longer to pay the whole thing off, in other words. So when we come back from break, we'll talk about foreclosure and that whole process of what's involved with the mortgage. I'll see you back here in 10. come back together for this last little bit. Got about 50 minutes to go. Let's see. Okay, can hear me, can see. Let's all come back in, turn those cameras back on. So now we get to the bad news, the bad situation. What happens when they don't successfully pay that mortgage over time? How does the bank maybe enforce this thing? How do they take it back? We have the process of foreclosure because of a default. But first, let's talk about what this mortgage looks like. When you borrow money to buy a house, it involves many things, but definitely two main documents. There's a mortgage, or in North Carolina, we call it a deed of trust. And there's also a promissory note. We use the term mortgage all the time, but that depends on the state you're in as to what it officially is called. Again, in North Carolina, it's not called a mortgage. Officially, it's called a deed of trust. We'll see what that means in a little bit. But there's two things you're going to be signing as a borrower. You're going to sign the mortgage or deed of trust, depending on the state you're in. And you're also going to sign the promissory note. What's the difference? The promissory note is the document that outlines what your payment's going to be and what the interest rate is going to be and how much you're borrowing and how long you're going to have to pay it back. Anytime you've ever borrowed something, a car loan, a student loan, you signed a promissory note that spelled out all of those terms of the actual loan itself. So the promissory note is not the mortgage. The mortgage is a separate document that you're also going to sign alongside signing the promissory note. This is the thing, again, that says gives the lender legal evidence that you promised to pay, legal evidence that you're borrowing their money. And it's in order for it to be a proper promissory note, the essential elements need to include the term of the loan, the promise that you're making to repay the loan. You're saying, yes, I'll pay this back, and the signature of yourself, if you're the borrower's signature. This does not get recorded, by the way, but the promissory note is between you and the lender. It's not for public record. It's not a recorded document in a transaction. And then it also has a term inside of it and contained in it that says this is a negotiable instrument. Negotiable doesn't mean that you can say, oh, you want 7% rate? I'll give you 6. Not that kind of negotiable. What negotiable means about the promissory note is that if the lender wants to do so, they could sell your promissory note to someone else. So now instead of you paying Bank of America, you now have to pay Wells Fargo because Bank of America sold your note to them. It could change. Anybody have a mortgage, ever had a mortgage that ended up changing who you had to send your payment to? It's relatively frequent, especially in a conventional type of loan. They tend to sell the loans more frequently when it's a conventional loan for a couple of reasons we'll talk about later. So that's the essence of a promissory note. It's got to have some essential elements. How long is the term? What's the promise? You're officially making the promise to repay, the terms of the loan, the payment, the rate, the duration, and the promise to repay, signature by the borrower. And then it is possible that the lender might sell it, transfer it to a third party for a profit. In other words, the lender might say, I don't want to wait for all the money. I don't want to wait the 30 years for this 30-year loan to pay me all that interest. Let me just get a chunk of money today, and I will pass along to someone else the requirement to be patient and receive this money every month for the next remaining term of the loan. So it's not recorded. You won't be able to search this at the Register of Deeds and find out what your neighbor's promissory note is for their mortgage. Something else that has to be in this promissory note are some special provisions. Because what happens if maybe you don't pay 1 month, and then you go another second month and a third and a fourth month, and you haven't been paying your mortgage as you promised to pay it, there's a provision in the promissory note that says the lender retains the right to call the entire balance due and payable if you miss a payment. And that moment that they're calling the entire balance due by sending you a letter is the first step to foreclosure, right? It's pretty much the foreclosure process beginning. So this clause that lets them do that, that's located in the promissory note, is the acceleration clause. They're accelerating the time that you have to pay them all their money. They originally gave you 30 years or 20 or 25 or whatever that term was, but now they want it today, immediately. Maybe not today, but right away, because that's the penalty. That's the penalty you have to pay for having not paid them as you promised to. Another provision that might be in the promissory note, maybe, not always, and it's not allowed to be in some of them, is possibly a prepayment penalty. The promissory note could say, we're going to charge you a penalty if you pay us back too early. The whole reason they're loaning you the money is they see the value in charging you interest over long term. And if you let that loan go for the entire 30 years, we saw that already. A $300,000 loan at, what was it? $300,000 loan for 30 years. I don't know if we saw the rate that was at or not, but it was going to cost them over $700,000. Take that 300 back away from the 7, that lender is getting back the 300 they loaned you and another 400,000 in interest on top of it, right? So they would rather, and they're going to get the most money if they just wait for the whole time. And so what if in the 3rd year you get transferred with your job? And so you sell the house and you use the proceeds of the sale of the house to pay off the loan as you are required to do. You have prepaid this thing early. You've paid it off earlier than they wanted you to. And if this prepayment penalty provision is in the promissory note, they could charge you a penalty fee in addition to the payoff amount, because you're basically sort of cheating them out of, you have the right to do it. It's not really cheating, but you're doing them out of all that interest they were going to be making if you kept it the whole time. It could also be that they charge a prepayment penalty not because you're selling the house and paying them off, but because you're refinancing the house with a different bank and then using that refinance money to pay this current lender off, and they're mad about that. Now you've swapped them for another lender, paid them off early, did them out of interest payments, and they're charged a penalty for that. Not all lenders are allowed, not all loans are allowed to have a prepayment penalty in them. You can't have a prepayment penalty in an FHA loan or a VA loan, and you can't use it at a certain price point in North Carolina for owner-occupied loans. You can't have a prepayment penalty in there either. So read the fine print. Find out, is there one? When you're shopping around for a loan, do they have a prepayment penalty built in? The third, and pretty much these are the top 3. This is an optional one. Remember, the acceleration clause is always going to be a part of the promissory note. And then another A word called the alienation clause. Another term for it is the due on sale clause. This is in that promissory note, and it says this: if you sell the property, we're not going to let you keep making the payments to us over time without the collateral of the property, right? Wouldn't that be nice, though? What if you had a mortgage and you got to pay the $1,000 a month for having borrowed $400,000 loan, and then you sell the house and you get $400,000 cash, and you still only have to pay that lender $1,000 a month? That would be lovely, but that'll never happen because there was an alienation clause in place that kept it from happening. The minute you try to sell the property, you've got to pay the lender off. So at the closing, the attorney is going to have to say, okay, you're selling it for $700,000. You still owe them $300,000. So I'm not going to give you a check for $700,000, seller. I'm going to give you a check for $700 minus $300, and then of course minus some other fees and costs that we'll talk about later. So promissory note includes an alienation clause. Alienation, the idea of selling the property. We saw that term before. I don't like that it's an A word because sometimes students mix it up with the acceleration clause. So when you think of the alienation clause, think of it by its other name, the due on sale clause. You have to pay them whatever you owe them, and it's due on the sale of the property that you have this mortgage for. Does that make sense? Is that pretty good? So definitely these two, due on sale and acceleration, are part of pretty much every promissory note. The prepayment penalty might be. The part about the promissory note that, again, says that it is negotiable, again, that just means the lender could sell it to another lender. And it's not that they're going to sell it one by one. We're not saying that some mortgage guy with Bank of America drives across town to the Wells Fargo and says, hey, I got one mortgage here to sell you. That's not how it works. They are selling them in big chunks, bulk sales of similar mortgages, of people that have similar credit scores, therefore similar levels of risk of repayment. And so the A credit people have the lowest chance of default, right? We're pretty confident they're going to really honor their mortgage and pay the promissory note on time. So they are more valuable. Those chunks of loans, these mortgages that are all A paper or top level credit people, they are bundled together in just big chunks of those types of mortgages and then bought and sold back and forth from one lender to another. And the marketplace in which that happens is called the secondary mortgage market. When you see that phrase secondary market, it's the bundling of mortgages that are similar and the selling from one institution, one lender to another for a big chunk of money. And because that maybe Bank of America says, let me bundle all of my A paper 30-year conventional loans together because I want to raise some capital to make more loans to more people. So they're going to bundle up what they have, sell them to Wells Fargo, and let Wells pay them a profit, a premium with a profit built in. And now they're just going to turn that money around and make more interest payments off of more new loans and build up another chunk and then probably sell that chunk again. And it's just this cycle. That is the secondary mortgage market. Well, if there's a secondary mortgage market, there must be a primary mortgage market. What is that one? We'll get into that a little bit later. But what it is when you and I go to the bank ourselves and say, please make me one single loan. It's the making of the loans one by one to the consumer, direct to consumer. That's the primary market, where you're talking to a loan officer and they're saying, yep, here's the rate, here's the terms. You want this kind of loan or that kind? Oh, I'll pick that. And then you sign up. And now you can buy the property. That's what's happening on the primary market. Then the lender builds them up, packs them up, sells them in big chunks on the secondary market. So by having the promissory note provision in place that says this is a negotiable instrument, it's basically the lender telling you giving you notice that they might, or at least they want to reserve the right to sell your mortgage packaged up with all those other ones on the secondary market. They can't change the terms on you. Just because they sell it to another lender doesn't mean your rate's going to change. Your payment is not allowed to change. Nothing changes. All of it's the same except the name to whom you make your payment. And they'll definitely make sure you are notified and you make that change properly. Okay. Now, we talked about the promissory note. When you close on a property, you're going to sign a whole lot of things. One of those things is the promissory note, which we just looked at. It's the loan terms, right? How much you're borrowing and for how long and for what rate. The other thing you're signing is the mortgage or deed of trust. Might be known as that, and it is known as that here in North Carolina, but it's the same concept. If the promissory note is the promise to pay, then let's think about this. What happens if you don't pay? What are they going to do to you and your property if you don't fulfill your promise to pay? What happens next, ultimately? Tell me that.
Foreclosure.
Foreclose on what? You're exactly right.
The property.
The property, silly, right? Neil, are you an idiot? I mean, the property. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. So does the promissory note mention the property, and is that the thing that lets them take the property? No, that's what this is. The mortgage is the collateral. It's the document that identifies the property as the collateral. Ever go to a pawn shop? People turn a watch into the pawn shop because they want a quick loan. They want to say, hey, what will you give me for my watch? It's a $2,000 watch. Okay, I'll give you $300 for it. Oh, okay. Well, I'm in desperate situation. Let me get $300. And maybe if you go back in time before they sell that watch, you could pay them back and get the watch back. The watch is collateral, right? Anything you're putting up for the loan is something that the lender has available to them in the worst case situation if you don't pay back. So if you don't, and you completely violate this promissory note and don't pay like you promised to, ultimately they can take the property, because the mortgage or the deed of trust serves as collateral, identifying the property being collateral for the loan. So those are the two documents, the two main documents. Now that we know that the mortgage is handling the property as collateral, let's talk about the difference in what we call them. Whether it's a mortgage or a deed of trust, here's what it's doing. It serves as representing the collateral for the loan, identifying the property that's what you stand to lose if you don't repay. If it's a mortgage state, by the way, South Carolina is a mortgage state, then this mortgage concept is a two-party system. It is the borrower and the lender. The borrower, also known as the mortgagor. By the way, before I knew better, I would have totally guessed that the mortgagor is the lender. Don't make that mistake, right? You're the one making the promise to repay, putting the property up as collateral. That makes you the mortgagor if you're the borrower. You're saying, yes, please give me this mortgage. I'll give you the property if I screw up and don't keep my promise. And then the one that you're giving the property to in the event of a default is the mortgagee or the lender. Another term you might see with this is a mortgage is a state where we call it a mortgage is called a lien theory state. A lien theory state compared to a title theory state over here. So title theory versus lien theory. The other thing about this type is that if they have to foreclose on you, they will pursue it with a judicial foreclosure, something that they have to sue you over in court. They've got to take you to court and sue you for the foreclosure in South Carolina and any other state that is a two-party mortgage system. Even though we call it a mortgage, just in general, in North Carolina, what it really is a three-party system called a deed of trust. And with this one, there's an extra person involved. The grantor is still the borrower. The beneficiary is what we call the lender this time, not the grantee. And then there's a third person, probably an attorney hired by the lender, called a trustee. They're holding that deed of trust until you pay off the entire note, at which point they will give you a release and you're now the full owner. So notice two-party system is mortgagor, mortgagee, borrower, lender. Three-party system is the mortgagor, the beneficiary who's the lender, and the trustee who's going to carry out this foreclosure process. It's a non-judicial foreclosure process in North Carolina or any other state that's a deed of trust state. They don't have to sue for foreclosure. Why? Because when you signed the deed of trust, you said, I agree that if I don't fulfill my promise to repay, you get to take my property as collateral. It's much more definitive in the paperwork of the deed of trust that they're not going to have to go to court over it. There's still a court date, but they don't have to sue to get this property in foreclosure. So an interesting thing we saw back in the 2000s, 2008, 9, 10, a lot of banks had to foreclose. There were a lot of people upside down in their mortgage who couldn't sell it for enough to pay off the mortgage. And so in South Carolina, it took longer for lenders to kick people out of their houses because they had to wait through the long, slow lawsuit process suing for foreclosure because it's a judicial foreclosure method that they used. But up here in North Carolina, it was quicker. The lenders could foreclose faster because they didn't have to go through that same long, lengthy court process of suing for foreclosure. They already had permission to foreclose that you gave them when you signed the deed of trust back in the early days when you were super optimistic and positive and thought, oh, this is great. Now I can buy a house. Sure, I'll sign whatever you want. Part of that deed of trust said, we don't have to sue you for foreclosure. We can just do it. And so once you are behind on some mortgage payments, this trustee person, again, probably an attorney's firm, will send you a letter. Says you've been behind. The lender is now calling this loan due and initiating the foreclosure process. That's how this stuff works. So for the test, for your purposes, they could ask you, how many parties are involved in a mortgage state or a lien theory state? You're going to say 2, the borrower and the lender. In mortgage lien theory, 2-party systems are a judicial foreclosure method where they have to sue you for foreclosure, whereas the 3-party system is the deed of trust type of state like North Carolina. A title theory versus a lien theory, that's the other little difference in terminology. So get that straight. These are the same essential type of forms, type of documents. They're accomplishing the same goal. What's the goal? Putting the property up as collateral for the loan. Are we okay there? Just some weird terms to get straight. So, the basic mortgage terms include the promissory note, which is the thing that says you owe the thing and you promise to repay. That's the debt instrument or the financing instrument. And then the mortgage in South Carolina, for instance, or the deed of trust in our state, that is the security instrument. The security of the loan held in place, anchored by the collateral called the actual property itself. That's the security instrument that locks the property into this promissory note. There's another term to learn, a nice big fat, I think it's 5-syllable term. And the word is hypothecation. Hypothecation. All that is the process of putting the property up as collateral, pledging the property as security for the loan. So when you sign the deed of trust in North Carolina, you're engaging in hypothecation. You're saying, yep, if I don't pay, you can take my property. How many months of payments could you possibly miss before they decide to foreclose on you? There is no statute. It depends on the lender. In fact, back in 2008, 9, 10, they were so backlogged that some people had not paid a mortgage payment in a year or more. They were just living there for free. They weren't really truly happy about it. They were stressed. Any day they could possibly get that foreclosure notice, but the lender had so many that they just couldn't possibly foreclose on them all, and they just had to finally get around to them eventually. And so the number of months of missed payments just totally depends on their choice. They might choose to initiate foreclosure after you only miss a couple of months, or maybe more like 4, 5, or 6. You never know. It depends. There are some essential elements required of this deed of trust. Remember the promissory note? We had some essential elements of the promissory note, and those were the term, the promise to repay, and the signature of the borrower. Let's look at the essential elements of the deed of trust. The identity and signature of the borrower. They need to sign this one too. A legal description, since we are connecting a property to this whole thing. So what property? Legal description for that, and it needs to be in writing. And here's another difference. The deed of trust is recorded. You can look up the deed of trust at the Register of Deeds website of whatever county you're in. You can find out what your neighbor's deed of trust looks like if you want to look it up, or your own for that matter. So the deed of trust does get recorded. The promissory note does not. So again, the promissory note has some clauses built in. Definitely an acceleration clause saying if you miss a payment, we can call the entire thing due. Definitely an alienation, also known as a due on sale clause, which says if you sell it, then the entire thing is due. You got to pay us from your proceeds. and then optionally maybe a prepayment penalty. What is the obligation of the borrower in this deed of trust situation? They've got to agree to make their payments. They've got to also pay the taxes and insurance, because this is a property that the lender cares a lot about. It is their collateral. They don't want it to be damaged or its value to decrease. So you better believe you got to pay the taxes. What could happen if you don't pay the taxes? Taxing office could foreclose on you. It's the number one lien priority. You could actually lose the property to the government because of not paying the taxes. So the mortgage, and that's the number one position. So the mortgage company definitely wants to make sure that you pay your taxes so as not to lose their collateral because the taxing authority foreclosed on it. And then insurance. In the event of destroyed property, damage to the property, we need to make sure that insurance is in place to cover it and restore it to its full value, full value in the event of some sort of damage problem. Maybe a natural disaster, maybe a fire. So the borrower needs to maintain the tax payments, maintain the insurance, and maintain the property. That means you can't let it be wasted. You can't just have fun sometimes, say, I don't live here anymore. I still have a mortgage, but let's just knock down this room. If you do any major modifications to the property, you would have to get approval from the lender first, and permission for any alterations because it is their collateral. They have a say in it. Some people jokingly say, I'm not the owner, the mortgage company is the owner. That's not true. You are the owner. It's just that the mortgage company has a vested interest because you own the collateral that you have put up for borrowing this money that lets you buy it. Got to maintain the property, keep its value up, and any alterations have to be given permission. So this property that I have used to be 6 acres. And so a developer bought 47 acres behind us. And they wanted to put a project in there for townhouses and apartments. And the main road around the corner that our road comes off of is going to be their entrance road. But they needed to be able to bring it out to a separate road, a different back exit. And that's why they offered us to buy one of our acres, one of our 6. 6. And it was the far right side of my property, so that they could eventually pull the road and make the road go all the way through their property. And then, like if here's my property and here's their project back here, this whole much bigger than mine, their road would come through and kind of just come down the side of mine like this. And my house is right here, and I've got a fenced yard and blah, blah, blah. And the house is actually much smaller in relation to the property because it's pretty good size. So I sold him this one little acre, this pretty much little green corner here, 1 acre. And in order to sell that to them, I still had this property with a mortgage. I still owed some money to the lender. I'd had this mortgage for 20 some years, so my loan balance had come down quite a bit, but I still owed it. And so my property, this entire property, was still collateral. Do you think I could just sell this 1 acre without getting permission from my lender? No. I was going to be decreasing their collateral from 6 acres down to 5 acres. And so they had to have a say in that. And I had to get their permission to allow me to do so, which involved them getting an appraisal. And so the communication was sort of not going so great. And the first appraiser that I had to pay for, $500 to send the appraiser out, he came in and he was walking through the house and he realized, wait a minute, what? You're selling this acreage over here, not the house at all? And I'm like, no, I'm staying in the house. I get to keep all of this, just selling that one little piece. He said, I shouldn't be here. You don't need me as an appraisal. You need a commercial appraisal. And oh, by the way, I would be making $500 on this. That commercial appraisal is probably going to cost $2,000 because they need to appraise the whole property and its land. And By that point, the buyer was getting impatient because it had dragged out. The lenders go in their own time. The buyer was threatening to sue me for specific performance. And I said, well, I'm not trying to avoid performing. How can you sue me for performance if I'm willing to do it? I'm waiting on the lender in this whole appraisal process. Finally, I realized I did some math, and I realized the amount that I owe on my loan compared to the amount that they're paying me for this chunk would let me just enough, by just barely a slim margin, be able to pay off the remaining loan. So I ended up just doing that. To heck with it. I'm not going to wait for your approval anymore, Mr. Lender. I'm certainly not going to pay $2,000 for an appraisal in order to get your approval for this thing. So forget it. Forget you. I'll just, instead of having a nice chunk of money like I thought I would, I'll just have a paid off property. So I just paid off the loan. Right? Not my preference. I'm not feeling sorry for myself. That's a pretty nice privilege, right? I do have to pay pretty steep taxes every year, by the way. It's in the city limits. It's 5 remaining acres. And literally the tax bill is about $11,400 a year. So I essentially have $1,000 a month tax bill paid once a year. So it's almost like a mortgage anyway, but at least I don't have that loan balance. So that's how that works. I would have needed the lender's permission to sell off part of their collateral. And if that would be the same thing if it were the house itself that I'd be dealing with. But I want to do a major thing to the house. I couldn't just tear it down. There's a neighborhood in Charlotte called Myers Park, a very enclosed, historic level era neighborhood. And a lot of people like to tear them down and build a nice new house because they like the location, but not the headaches that come with an old house. If they had a mortgage on that house, they wouldn't be able to tear it down and replace it without the permission of their lender, and maybe not even ever get that permission. What else? In North Carolina, the common phrase, the fun phrase that we go by is that it takes 1 to buy and 2 to sell when you're married, right? One spouse could buy it without the other spouse even knowing about it if all they're going to do is pay cash. But the minute they decide to sell it, that spouse who never knew they had ever bought it is going to have to be told, because they're going to have to sign some things. And so the tenants by the entirety married situation involves signing off on some things. If you're buying a property and you're married, maybe sometimes married people fall in love with a spouse who isn't as financially responsible as they are. And you've got maybe one of the spouses that is on top of things and the other one that's just a basket case and has terrible credit. So in that event, will they both be on the promissory note? No, because the lender wouldn't approve it. They don't want one of them who has terrible credit on this note, and only one qualifies for the loan. So that person is on the promissory note, but they both still would have to sign the deed of trust. If one qualifies and the other doesn't, only one is signing the promissory note because the other one doesn't qualify for the loan. But since the deed of trust is saying we get to take your property if you don't fulfill your promise to repay, they both need to be on record as having signed off, understanding the collateral piece of this thing. So keep that in mind. It could be a testable thing. Promissory note could be signed by only one of them. Deed of trust has to be signed by both of them, even if only one is going to be on the loan. So again, in that lien theory concept, like in South Carolina, where we call it a mortgage, we've got a mortgagor called the borrower, the lender's called the mortgagee. The borrower or mortgagor retains legal and equitable title, whereas the lender, mortgagee, holds the promissory note. And then the North Carolina version, the title theory deed of trust concept, the borrower retains equitable title, and the deed of trust is held by the trustee holding that legal title, and then the lender holds the promissory note, just like they do in the mortgage situation. So instead of the borrower holding both legal and equitable title, borrower gets equitable, attorney / trustee gets legal title. You got a couple rights. You got a lot of rights when you own property. One of them is the right to possess the property. It's yours. Yes, you owe collateral to the lender if you don't pay, but as long as you pay, everything's fine. You also have the right to quiet enjoyment, meaning that lender can't just come in anytime. They never come in. The lender's not coming, right? So you have the right to possession. It's your property. Do with it, for the most part, what you want, subject to zoning rules and laws and HOA and covenants and restriction rules and laws and building codes and all that. But for the most part, you can put a fence up. Maybe it needs to be a certain height or certain material. And you can rent it if you want to, and you can sell it if you want to. And then the right to quiet enjoyment. You also have the right to pay off the debt. Defeasance is a word for canceling the mortgage debt because you paid it off. So defeasance, you've paid everything off. When it comes to not making your mortgage payment, and now they're sending you the foreclosure letter. When you first get the foreclosure notice, you're in this equity period of redemption. And so in this period of time, if you can scrape up enough money to pay back what you owe, the late payments that you've missed, the missed payments, plus penalties and interest that might have accrued, then you could save it from going into foreclosure during this equity period of redemption. How likely is that to happen? Well, unless you win the lottery or grandma gives you money or somehow you sell off a bunch of stuff and make it happen, that could be a thing. But if you can't, then it keeps on going through the foreclosure process and reaches the statutory period of redemption, in which case now it's too late for the buyer to save it. Even if you scraped up the money, you're past that point. Now it's going to go to auction. Now there's going to be an auction where there's what's called a 10-day upset bid period. It's going to the courthouse. Somebody can make a bid to buy it, and that's going to be the first bid. And then someone else could come along and within 10 days make a better bid than that. They'll probably have something in place that says, we're not talking about $300,000 and then go up to $300,001. No, it'd be a certain percentage over the current bid would be a requirement. And then that could just keep going on and on. That 10-day upset bid period, maybe on the 9th or 10th day, somebody makes a better offer, another higher offer, and it happens again and again and again. Eventually, people are going to stop because the value of the property compared to the offer it's going to take to beat the current one is not going to be worthwhile, right? So those are the two main periods of time following a foreclosure letter. The equity period when the buyer can still save it, the statutory period when it's going to auction. It's too late. The upset bid period starts. And we just go back and forth until somebody finally wins. What are the lender's rights? Lender's rights are ultimately foreclosure. We talked about it. The collateral given by the deed of trust. And the foreclosure rights basically say if you don't keep paying, you can't stay. Don't pay, you can't stay. And that's how a lot of closing attorneys will explain it at the closing table. They'll say, hey, borrower, sign right here, this deed of trust. It says that if you don't pay, you can't stay. And the different kinds of foreclosure that there are, we already saw these two, judicial and non-judicial. Judicial is the kind in South Carolina with the mortgage two-party system, and they have to sue you for foreclosure. The non-judicial is the kind in North Carolina with the three-party deed of trust title theory state. And that one is built into the deed of trust that they can just send you the foreclosure letter from the trustee and then not have to sue you in court over it. And then eventually it'll get to that statutory period of redemption where you have to just sit there and watch it be sold at auction at the courthouse, basically, with the 10-day upset bid period. There's another kind of foreclosure that we don't do called a strict foreclosure, but that involves like the lender saying, are we going to foreclose because maybe it's worth a whole lot, and if we foreclose, then we could get a whole lot of money and sort of make a profit there. And it can be a bit predatory, but the main two that we run into in North Carolina, it's the non-judicial version. And in South Carolina and other states like it, the two-party system, it's a judicial method. When there is the foreclosure sale and it's all finished, then the proceeds from the sale have to be spent and paid towards certain things that might be attached to the property. The first of which is going to be not the property taxes, as I preached to you for so many times before, but actually we got to pay for the court cost of doing this thing. So first, at this point, when it's a foreclosure, the cost of the sale, court costs required for this foreclosure sale gets covered first. Then if there are property taxes owed, if there are special assessments owed, those are paid next from the proceeds of the foreclosure sale. And then liens in order of when they were recorded. The specific liens first, the general liens second in order of recordation. Guess what? Maybe the foreclosure auction didn't sell it for quite enough money so that all of the liens on the record get paid. Remember that part? The race system, get to their courthouse first to get your place in line as soon as you can. There might be some mechanics liens that remain unpaid because there's not enough money left over from the foreclosure. So you want to have the highest priority you possibly can. Record as soon as you can so that you stand to maybe get some of these scraps that are left after all these things are paid. Who knows? Maybe they weren't behind on the property taxes and assessments. So maybe there is more money available for all those other potential liens that could be against the property. So what if the lender that foreclosed isn't happy with how much they ended up getting in the foreclosure sale? It wasn't enough based on how much they were still owed. Well, maybe they would choose to say, hey, borrower, this foreclosure sale did not pay me everything that you owe me. And so now I'm going to put a deficiency judgment on you that will be carried around like a backpack by you until you finally pay me off. So yes, the foreclosure sale paid a good part of it, but I still want you to pay me more. And I'm going to put a deficiency judgment on you. Good luck getting a loan with a deficiency judgment on your credit, right? So they're carrying this judgment after the fact, even after that foreclosure has happened. The lender could also put a deficiency judgment on a borrower after negotiating a short sale closing. So a buyer makes an offer for a short sale. It doesn't go to foreclosure. The lender agrees to take less than what's owed, but part of that agreement might be only if you, the borrower, also get a deficiency judgment on yourself where you owe me the final $5,000, $10,000, however much it might be. However long it's going to affect their credit until you finally pay it off. So that's what a deficiency judgment is, and it could be utilized as part of the foreclosure process or as part of the short sale process for that matter. Something else the lender could do is assign the mortgage debt, again, transfer it over, sell it to someone else, and now your mortgage payment needs to go to this other lender, not the one you started with. And then we saw the short sale addendum today. A short sale, again, is a way to avoid foreclosure altogether. The seller would have to prove that they're in financial hardship by writing a letter saying, here's my situation. I have medical bills. I lost my job. I have all these problems. And also, the lender is going to want to see some proof of all this stuff. So the lender's going to say, send me the documentation, the letter, as well as your bank statements, as well as your tax returns. And oh, by the way, don't think that you can just secretly slide $10,000 over into your 5-year-old's savings account, because we want to see that too. They're going to ask for everything. They want to see every possible way. And oh, by the way, you have 2 credit cards and you can take out a $3,000 cash advance from them. Go ahead and do that and give us the money. They want that too. Before they give the gracious gift of letting you pay them back what you owe them, they're going to squeeze every ounce of juice out of every other place they possibly can. It's ugly, but it avoids foreclosure. The foreclosure, like a bankruptcy, could stick to your credit for like 10 plus years. Some say the short sale isn't that much less, but ideally, the idea is the short sale is better in the long run, not easier, but it's quicker to overcome and than the record of a foreclosure. Short sale requires that the seller's lender give approval. We talked about how that's not going to happen fast, probably. It's going to take a long time. And for our purposes as a broker, we have to tell the world this seller is selling, but it's got to be a short sale that they're going to sell it within, meaning their lender has to approve it. That's a material fact. We can't not tell the world that it's a short sale. It has to go through the short sale process. That approval takes time. The buyer can walk away at any time. The lender can choose to replace the contract with a different contract that might come in along the way. So it's a pretty brutal process. But it avoids foreclosure. Another thing that avoids foreclosure instead of a short sale could be this thing called a deed in lieu of foreclosure. In lieu of means instead of. So a deed in lieu of the foreclosure is saying, look, let's avoid foreclosure. Let me go ahead and just give you the keys. Basically, it's here's the keys to the house. I'm going to walk away from it and any equity I might have had in it. But I at least don't have to worry about the foreclosure. But the problem with a deed in lieu of foreclosure, it too could include a deficiency judgment that the borrower has to still deal with after the fact. I gave you the keys. You took my house back. I didn't even make you challenge it and pursue it with the foreclosure, but they could still put a deficiency judgment on you. Let's see, if the short sale is approved, what happens to the difference in the loan amount and the short sale total? Is that just a loss for the lender? So the lender is going to let you, that's why the approval takes so long, because they're deciding, am I going to be willing to take this loss? And that's also why it's so brutal. And they're saying, look, I'm not just trying to take a loss. If I can get you to give me a cash advance, if I can also end up with granting this, but only if you also agree to pay me back more later with the deficiency judgment. So that's why they're resistant and it takes so long and they want to see all this proof because it is going to be a loss to them. Of course, you could sell the property and get a new loan to pay off the current loan. It could be a cash sale that pays off the current loan balance. So all of that is a possibility too. You could also do a thing in general. We're not talking so much about foreclosures right now, but you could sell the property to an investor, for instance, and that property could be subject to the existing loan. That can be tricky though. When an investor approaches a homeowner and says, because that homeowner maybe called them on an ad they ran about, do you want money to sell your house fast? I'll make an offer fast. It's probably because they want a steep discount. The investor recognizes it's a $400,000 house. Maybe they could buy it for $200,000. There's a lot of equity in there that they could strip from the seller and enjoy themselves by turning around and flipping it or assigning it to another investor. Or they could say, hey, seller, sign the deed over to me with a quitclaim deed, and we won't tell your current lender that you're doing this, and I'll just keep making your current monthly payment every month as if you're doing it. That way, your credit's okay. You're going to have monthly payments on the record because I'm the one paying it. We don't need to bother the lender and tell them that we're doing it. You're going to give me ownership by a quitclaim deed, and everything should be fine, except that it is loan fraud because not telling the lender that you're selling the property is not allowed. It's loan fraud. If they find out, number one, they could enact the due on sale clause. You sold it. We need all our money. That's why they want you to stay quiet about not telling your lender. Just let them send in the payment so it stays protected. So some of these investor ideas that you might see, hear about, learn about in a course for investing involve things that are pretty sort of tricky, pretty rocky. As brokers, we run for the hills when anytime loan fraud is a remote possibility. We want to make sure, because ultimately the penalties for it are a 30-year prison sentence maximum, $1 million fine. So let's not do that, right? Loan assumptions are actually more frequent now. It's actually in this year's update course because since the rates were in the 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s last couple years, now they're in the 7s, maybe even a little higher shortly. People might just have the idea, let's assume your loan for 2.5% from 4 years ago rather than get a new bank loan. And so in this case, you would have to be qualified to assume a person's loan. The lender knows about it. They're willing to let you assume their loan. You, as the borrower who's assuming it, have to meet assumption requirements like certain credit score, debt to income ratios. We'll talk about what that is later. Here's the short version. Whatever you make per month, you have a maximum of that amount that you're allowed to put toward your payment. Depending on the type of loan, a certain percentage of your monthly income max can go toward the loan. That's your debt to income ratio. And so that would be affected by the loan assumption. You'd have to qualify and be able to handle that and survive that too. In a loan assumption situation, and then we'll be done. The foreclosure deficiency first falls on the buyer and then second on the seller in this assumption situation. So keep paying. If you don't, it could get ugly for everybody. We'll talk more about this, keep on going through finance and get into a lot of finance math. There's a good bit of math. So go ahead and read ahead, and I will see you next week. Let me know. Let me think. After we get through this finance chapter, I'll tell you, I'll let you go ahead and take the midterm because there are some finance related questions in it. But I hope you have a great week, great weekend. See you next week.